The noise the steel makes when something hits it from outside is different than what you'd expect. Most people probably imagine this big hollow boom, like getting hit with a pipe in a parking garage. It's not like that. It's more of a thud, heavy, wet, almost soft, like someone dropping a bag of sand against the side of a building. That's what it sounds like when one of them walks into the bus. I'm in the driver's seat right now and I'm counting thuds. 7 in the last 4 minutes. 7 is fine. 7 I can manage. 47 is when I start having to think seriously about moving. The engine is running. It's always running now. I stopped turning it off about 3 weeks ago. Give or take. I've lost some accuracy on the calendar. Because one morning I turned the key, and the engine took 11 seconds to catch, and those 11 seconds were the worst 11 seconds I'd experienced up until that point in my life. Which is saying something given what the previous weeks had looked like. So now the engine runs. I do the math on fuel consumption every morning, and the math is manageable as long as I don't sit in one spot for longer than about 36 hours, and I try not to sit for longer than 20. Right now I've been here being the access road behind a Menards distribution center outside of Elroy, Wisconsin, for about 14 hours. The Menards is picked mostly clean, but I found 2 industrial respirators in a stockroom that nobody had gotten to, and I found a rack of heavy-duty zip ties, and I found a crate of 3/8-inch drive socket extensions that I didn't need, but that my hands reached for automatically, because I'm a mechanic, and when I see a socket extension, I pick it up. There are limits to that instinct, but I haven't found them yet. Patty is asleep on the 3rd row of seats. She sleeps with one arm over her face, like she's blocking out light even though the windows are covered. Roger is in the back section, which we call the back section because it used to be a lounge area with a small wet bar, and now it's where people who need privacy go to either cry or have arguments. And right now Roger is in there not sleeping, and occasionally I can hear him shifting around on the sofa cushions. Colleen is up front with me, cross-legged in the seat behind mine, reading a book she found 2 stops ago. She reads with the book almost touching her nose. I've told her twice to get some sleep, and she said yeah, both times without looking up, and didn't do it. I stopped telling her. Walt is sleeping in the 2nd row. Walt sleeps like a man with a clear conscience, which is interesting, given what I know about Walt's briefcase. But I've learned not to read too much into how people sleep. 8 thuds now. Still fine. Let me back up and explain the bus. The bus is a 2019 Prevost H345, 45 feet long, 13 feet tall, GVW just over 54,000 pounds fully loaded. The manufacturer spec says the engine is a Detroit diesel DD13, 450 horsepower, 1,550 foot-pounds of torque. The previous owner, a charter company out of Nashville that went bankrupt before the outbreak for completely unrelated reasons, had the interior done by a custom coach shop in Indiana. 8 captain's chairs, all leather, all with individual reading lights and USB ports. A wet bar, a bathroom with a full-size toilet and a shower that technically worked, but produced water pressure so weak it was more of a dribble. Entertainment system with a 42-inch screen, climate control, the whole thing. Very nice. Very useless for what I needed it for. I bought it at auction for $63,000, which was about $40,000 less than it was worth because nobody trusts a bus that came out of a bankruptcy sale. And I spent the next 8 months doing the mechanical work myself, replacing injectors, rebuilding the air suspension, going through the electrical system connector by connector, because whoever the previous operator's mechanic had been, he was the kind of person who zip-tied wires to things they shouldn't be zip-tied to, and called it a day. Then I spent another 4 months doing the cosmetic work with money I didn't exactly have. New carpet, repainted interior, had the exterior wrapped in a dark charcoal gray, because the previous company's branding was a lime green that I couldn't look at. I named it the Marquis. I painted that in small white letters on the door below the luggage compartment, because I'd been reading some English history, and I thought the name was dignified without being pretentious. My ex-wife, when I told her, said that was the most me thing I'd ever said. I'm still not sure what she meant by that. The business was called Holt Premier Coaches. Just me. I drove, I maintained, I scheduled, I invoiced, I filed the taxes quarterly, and hated every second of the taxes. I had a client list of about 60 regular customers, corporate groups, wedding parties, winery tours, a few private individuals who wanted to get from Chicago to Minneapolis or Cleveland to Pittsburgh without dealing with airports. The margins were thin, but the work was mine, and after 18 years of fixing other people's vehicles on a county maintenance schedule, that mattered more than I knew how to say out loud. I should tell you what I was before the bus. I worked for the county for the better part of 2 decades as an emergency vehicle mechanic. Ambulances, fire apparatus, police interceptors. If it had lights and a siren on it and it belonged to Dane County, Wisconsin, I probably touched it at some point. I was good at the work. I don't say that to pat myself on the back. I say it because it matters for everything that came after. I understood engines the way some people understand people. I could hear a problem before it showed up on a diagnostic. I could feel in the steering wheel whether a front axle was wearing wrong. The work wasn't glamorous, but it was honest, and it was mine. I left because of a dispute over something so stupid, I'm still embarrassed to say it plainly. The county reclassified my position during a budget restructuring, and the new classification affected my pension calculation by an amount that worked out to about $11.40 per month in retirement. $11.40. I argued about it for 2 years, filed grievances, went to meetings, got told no every time in language that was perfectly polite, and made me want to put my head through a wall. Finally, I left, bought the bus, started over at 43. My daughter Kira thinks I was stupid to fight so hard over $11 a month. She's probably right. She's 24 and lives in Portland, and we talk on the phone maybe 4 times a year, which I know is not enough, and I know that's mostly my fault, and I think about it more than I tell anyone. Anyway, the bus, the outbreak, let me get there. I was running a corporate tour when I first heard anything. November, 6 months before things went completely sideways. A pharmaceutical company out of Chicago, Mervin Biotech, some subsidiary of something larger, had hired me for a 3-day Midwest tour. They were doing some kind of team-building thing, taking their sales team to see historic sites across Wisconsin and Minnesota. 7 passengers, all between 30 and 50, all in khakis and branded fleeces, all very polite, in the way that people are polite when they're using company money and want everything logged correctly. I don't remember all their names now. One of them was a woman named Deborah who kept standing in the aisle while I was driving, and I had to ask her twice to sit down. One was a man who fell asleep in his seat during the first hour and stayed that way for the entire first day except for bathroom stops. The rest blur together. What I remember is that on the second day, one of them, a younger guy, maybe late 20s, had been on his phone constantly since we left Chicago, started watching the news on his phone with the volume low enough that I couldn't quite make out the words, but high enough that I could hear it was news and not something else. I picked up words here and there. Hospital, quarantine, Pennsylvania. He watched it for a long time without saying anything to the others, then put his phone away and looked out the window. I didn't say anything. None of my business. People watch news on buses. The world has problems on a rotating basis, and someone on a bus in Wisconsin can't do much about most of them. That night in the hotel in Minneapolis, I went online and looked at what was happening in Pennsylvania. There were 3 articles about a cluster of unusual illness cases in the Pittsburgh metropolitan area. The Pittsburgh Health Department was issuing statements about a respiratory illness with some neurological components. Nothing alarming in the language. The language was very calm and very measured, and used phrases like monitoring the situation and no cause for public concern at this time. There were maybe 600 comments under the articles, and about 2/3 of them were people being scared, and about 1/3 were people telling the scared people they were overreacting. I read through it for about 20 minutes, decided it was probably another respiratory thing that would get bad for a few weeks, and then disappear, and went to sleep. I was wrong, obviously, but I want to be clear. So was almost everyone else. The thing about being wrong about something this big is that it doesn't feel like being wrong at first. It feels like being reasonable. The second time I noticed something was about 3 weeks later. I'd done 2 more runs by then. a wedding party to Madison and back, and a small group from a law firm in Chicago to a retreat center in Door County. Normal stuff. Nothing unusual. Then I was driving back from Door County, empty bus, late on a Sunday afternoon, and I stopped for fuel at a Pilot on I-43. There was a woman at the pump next to mine having a phone conversation that I couldn't help overhearing because she was speaking at the volume people use when they're frightened and don't realize it. She was talking to someone about her brother. Her brother was in a hospital in Cleveland. She was saying that the doctors weren't giving a straight answer about what was wrong with him, that he'd come in with a fever and confusion, and by the next morning he was just not himself anymore. And whatever that meant to her was clearly very bad, because her voice kept catching on the words. I filled my tank. She finished the conversation and got in her car. I drove home. Over the next month, these kind of overheard fragments started accumulating. A conversation at a truck stop between two drivers about something happening in Columbus. A news segment I caught in a diner that was there and then gone, replaced by a weather segment before I could fully absorb what I'd seen. Something about a containment protocol in a county I'd never heard of. A posting in an online mechanics forum I use. Someone from outside Philadelphia asking whether anyone else was seeing road closures near the I-95 interchange. Weird ones. National Guard vehicles parked sideways across the exit ramps. I wasn't connecting the dots exactly, not consciously, but something in my brain was starting to pay attention, the way it pays attention when an engine is making a noise that isn't quite wrong yet, but is headed in a direction. In February, I pulled the bus into my garage. I rent a commercial space, big enough for the bus with room to work around it, and I started on some maintenance I'd been putting off. While I was under the chassis with a trouble light, I noticed a section of the underbody that had some light surface corrosion that I didn't love. I started grinding it back to clean metal, and while I was doing that, I was also, for reasons I didn't fully examine, thinking about steel plate. I had some, left over from when I'd built a workbench for the garage. 3/16-inch mild steel, about 8 sheets of various sizes. I'd been meaning to use it for something, or sell it for scrap for about 6 months, and done neither. I looked at the corrosion on the underbody of the bus, and then I thought about the sections of the wheel wells that were exposed, and then I thought about the body panels down at the lower sides, and I don't know exactly when the thought shifted from I should do some undercoating to something different, but it did. I started cutting steel that night. I want to be honest about this. I did not consciously think I was preparing for a zombie apocalypse. I'm not sure that thought had even formed yet. I think what I was doing was more like anxiety work. The same way some people clean their house when they're stressed, or go for a run. I was doing something productive with my hands that was also, incidentally, making the underside of my bus harder to damage. I was sleeping better than I had in months. By March, I had the lower body panels reinforced on both sides, from the front wheel wells back to about the midpoint. 3/16 plate, welded clean, with a coat of bedliner over the top so it wouldn't look alarming. I had replaced the standard door hinges with heavier-duty commercial hinges from a loading dock supply company. I had installed a secondary locking bar on the main entry door, interior side only, just a steel bar that dropped into a receiver I welded to the floor. Total cost about $40 in materials, 20 minutes of work. I had also, because I was in that space where one thing leads to another, started thinking about the windows. The Prevost H345 has large windows by coach bus standards. Good views, great for sightseeing tours. Terrible for what I was beginning to think about in the hours when I wasn't thinking about anything specific. The glass was the passenger-grade kind, laminated, impact-resistant, but not intended for what windows in a military vehicle are intended for. I couldn't afford proper ballistic glazing, and I wasn't sure I could find it anyway. What I could do was build exterior screens, steel bar grills, basically, welded to a mounting frame that bolted through the window frame from inside. They would reduce visibility, but they would stop a fist, and increasingly, that was what mattered to me. I built the first set in March. I didn't install them yet. I wasn't ready to explain to a client why their luxury coach had bars on the windows, but I built them and stacked them in the garage, each one labeled with a piece of masking tape indicating which window it fit. That was March. By April, everything was different. I remember the exact day things moved from worrying pattern to, this is actually happening. April 14th. I had a group of 4 booked for a run to Chicago, corporate clients doing some kind of site visits, the kind of thing where I drive them to 3 different buildings and wait in a parking structure between stops and try not to fall asleep. I got to the pickup point, a hotel in Madison, at 7 in the morning, and nobody came down. I waited 20 minutes, which is standard. Called the contact number. No answer. Waited another 10 minutes, went inside, found the lobby empty, except for one person at the front desk, who was watching something on a laptop screen, with a look on his face that I recognized from the woman at the gas pump months earlier. That specific combination of concentrated attention and poorly controlled fear. I said, I'm here to pick up a party of 4. He said, without looking away from the screen, I don't think they're coming down. I said, did they check out? He said, I don't think anyone's leaving right now. I went back to the bus and sat in the driver's seat and pulled up the news on my phone. I had to open 4 different news sites because 2 of them were loading so slowly they were essentially frozen. And when I finally got a page to load, I sat there and read it for probably 10 minutes without moving. They were calling it HAV7, hemorrhagic atypical virus 7. I don't know why they called it that. Later I heard it called 7 other names depending on who was talking and where they were from, but HAV7 is what I heard first and it stuck. The CDC had issued an emergency declaration. 5 states had activated National Guard units. The words mass casualty incident appeared in an article about a hospital in Cincinnati. There was a grainy cell phone video embedded in one article that I pressed play on once and then did not watch a second time. I drove the bus back to my garage. I did not wait for the clients to call and cancel. I just left. I spent that day making calls. My ex-wife, Janet, who was in Madison and who I'd spoken to exactly twice in the previous year. She didn't pick up. My daughter, Kira, in Portland. She picked up on the second ring, which surprised me, because she usually doesn't. Hey, I said. I know, she said. I know, Dad. I'm watching it. You need to go somewhere. Not your apartment. Somewhere better than your apartment. Do you know people outside the city? I have a friend in Astoria with a house. Go there. Today. Take food. Take whatever you have in your medicine cabinet. Take that. Take a sleeping bag. Are you being serious right now? Kira, yeah, I'm being serious. There was a pause. Then she said, what are you going to do? I'm going to make the bus safe. Another pause. Do you want me to come to you? I thought about that. Kira in Madison, or Kira with a friend outside Portland in a house. Go to Astoria, I said. Call me when you get there. She called me 11 days later. I was in the bus, already moving. The connection was so poor I could barely hear her. She said she was okay, and she was with her friend, and they had enough food for a while. I said good. I said I loved her. She said I love you too, Dad. And then the signal dropped, and I haven't reached her since. I think about that a lot. Not productively, but I think about it. The 2 weeks between April 14th and the day I finally moved the bus out of the garage are what I'd call the modification period, if I was writing a report about it, which I'm not, but the habit of thinking in terms of periods and phases is hard to shake when you've worked for a municipal government. I worked 18 to 20 hours a day. I slept on the sofa in the corner of the garage for 3 or 4 hours at a stretch. I ate from the snack machine in the hallway of the building, which was still being restocked by someone for the first week, and then stopped being restocked, but still had things in it. Here's what I did to the bus in those 2 weeks, in roughly the order I did it. The window grills went on first, the ones I'd pre-built in March. I installed all 14 of them in one day, working from a ladder, drilling through the exterior frame, and running bolts through to interior mounting plates. Ugly as hell, but solid. The windows were now functionally covered from about the midpoint down, which blocked the lower viewing angle, but left the upper glass clear enough to see out of from a seated position. The main entrance door, the folding bifold door on the right side near the front, I rebuilt from the frame out. The original mechanism was a power-assisted fold, very nice for passengers, completely wrong for security. I disconnected the power assist and installed a manual pull system, then added the drop bar I'd built in March, plus a secondary deadbolt, mounted to a steel plate I welded over the factory mounting hardware. The door now had about 3 times the closure strength it was designed with. It still wasn't great. It was still a bus door, but it was significantly better. The luggage compartments along the bottom of the bus I converted into storage. The original flip-up doors were secured with mediocre latches. I added hasp locks with padlocks, not because I expected a sophisticated attacker, but because a latched compartment is harder to stumble into than an unlatched one, and I was thinking about motion and weight distribution and keeping my stuff in my stuff. I added a second battery bank. The bus already had a house battery system for the interior accessories, the lighting, the entertainment system, the climate control. I pulled the entertainment system out entirely and used the space in that console for 4 additional Group 31 deep cycle batteries, wired in parallel to the existing house bank. Then I added a 400-watt solar charging system on the roof. 3 panels, angled forward because that's what the roof geometry allowed. It wasn't a sophisticated setup, but it meant I could maintain the house bank without running the main engine, which mattered for fuel and for noise. The generator. The bus had an Onan diesel genset in the front bay. I serviced completely. New belts, new coolant, new fuel filters. Then I added a 35-gallon auxiliary fuel tank in one of the luggage bays, plumbed to both the main fuel tank and the generator. The auxiliary filled from the same fill point as the main, with a valve to direct flow. More range, more flexibility. The interior, I reworked over 3 days. Pulled out the wet bar and the entertainment console and most of the decorative stuff, the overhead bins, the fold-down tables on the backs of the seats. Made space. Kept all 8 captain's chairs, because they were good for sleeping, and I wasn't going to carry strangers standing up. In the rear lounge area, I built a low platform from plywood and 2x4 framing, and covered it with the cushions from the fold-out sofa. Better sleeping surface. And the space under the platform became storage, specifically for the equipment that didn't go in the luggage bays, the things I wanted accessible without going outside. I built a small kitchen setup. Camp stoves, 2 of them, on a fold-down shelf near the rear emergency exit. A deep plastic tub bolted to the floor to contain spills. A collection of pots and pans from a camping supply store, which I cleaned out along with its entire stock of freeze-dried food and a significant portion of its fuel canister supply. I also took the camp stoves and their display models. Nobody stopped me. The owner was not there. I left money on the counter. I still did that for the first week. Left cash for what I took from unattended stores. I stopped doing that eventually, but not right away. Water was a significant problem. The bus had a fresh water tank of about 40 gallons for the bathroom, but 40 gallons is not much when you're not sure where the next source is coming from. I added 3 55-gallon Ace Rotomold water tanks in the luggage bays, each one on a wooden cradle I built to keep it from rolling, and plumbed them with a hand pump to a line that ran up through a floor fitting into the interior. I also added a gravity-fed filtration setup, 3-stage ceramic filter mounted near the kitchen shelf, for water I couldn't verify. The whole water system was ugly and cobbled together and worked perfectly for what I needed. Medical supplies. I'm not a paramedic, I'm a mechanic. I know how to splint something in a hurry, and how to pack a wound, and how to do CPR with reasonable technique. Because emergency vehicle mechanics are required to recertify every 2 years. And I know what a tension pneumothorax sounds like, because I'd worked alongside paramedics for 18 years, and you absorb things. What I assembled was based on what I knew and what I could find. 2 trauma kits from the emergency supply shop on the east side of Madison, owner not there, left cash. A large supply of over-the-counter pain relief and infection control, ibuprofen, acetaminophen, amoxicillin from the vet supply section of a farm store. Because veterinary amoxicillin and human amoxicillin are the same molecule and I don't have ethical feelings about this. Antibacterial ointment, jaws in volume, suture material that I hoped I wouldn't need to use, a blood pressure cuff, glucose tablets, SAM splints, a tourniquet from the first trauma kit, and a second one I ordered 2 days before internet ordering stopped working. Tools. I packed what I actually use, not everything I own. That was a temptation I resisted, because weight matters and I know what I actually reach for. A quality socket set, 2 adjustable wrenches, a set of combination wrenches from 8mm to 24mm, needle nose pliers, regular pliers, channel lock pliers in 2 sizes, a full set of screwdrivers, including the specialty ones you need for the Prevost's interior panels, a cordless drill and 4 batteries and a charger, a reciprocating saw and blades, a grinder, an angle grinder, a welding setup. I used a small MIG welder that runs on a 240-volt circuit, and I had an inverter installed that could run it from the house battery bank in a pinch, though only for short bursts. Cutting wheels, wire brush wheels, welding rod, a full selection of drill bits, 2 magnetic parts trays, a trouble light, 2 headlamps, a floor jack that I could slide under the bus in about 90 seconds. I also took a fire extinguisher from the wall of the garage hallway and added it to the 4 I already had on the bus, 2 in the cab area and 2 in the rear. 6 total. The fire situation in a vehicle is one I think about because of my background, and my background says that fire is the thing that makes everything else irrelevant. Defensive equipment. I want to be careful about how I say this, because I'm not a violent person by disposition, and I've spent most of my life in a profession that is about fixing things rather than breaking them. But I'm also not an idiot, and the things that were happening outside by the time I was finishing the bus were very clear about what I needed to be ready for. I had a .357 revolver that I'd owned for 15 years, mostly just for the habit of having it, with about 200 rounds of ammunition. I added a 12-gauge pump shotgun from the same farm store where I'd gotten the amoxicillin. They had a rack of them behind the register, locked, but the glass in the case had already been broken by someone, and I took one with a short barrel and 2 boxes of shells. I also took a hatchet from the tool section and a crowbar, a 36-inch flat bar crowbar, because those are useful for 10 things besides the obvious one, and they don't require ammunition. The last thing I added, on the second to last day before I left, was the ram. The ram was my own design. I had built vehicle push bumpers before, heavy-duty steel tube bumpers for county emergency vehicles that needed to be able to push abandoned cars out of the way. I knew how to build one. The challenge was mounting one to the front of the Prevost, which has a relatively shallow nose and no good factory mounting points for that kind of load. I ended up fabricating a mounting bracket that picked up 6 points on the front frame, 2 of which required drilling through the factory frame rails and installing threaded inserts. It took a full day. The bracket was not pretty. It was overbuilt by any reasonable standard, which meant it was correctly built by my standard. And the ram itself was 2-inch square steel tube in a plow configuration, curved upward slightly at the wingtips to direct things away from the wheel wells rather than into them. Total added weight to the bus was somewhere between 1,800 and 2,400 pounds depending on water fill level. The suspension handled it. I'd upgraded the front airbags the previous winter anyway. I left Madison on April 28th at about 4 in the morning. The city was quiet that early in a way that wasn't the normal kind of quiet. The traffic lights were still working, but there was nothing to stop and go for. I saw 4 cars on the way out, all going in one direction, south, away from downtown. A dog was sitting on the sidewalk outside a closed pharmacy, watching me drive past. I don't know why I remember the dog specifically, but I do. Brown and white, some kind of hound mix. It looked fine, just sitting there. I went north. North made sense, because north was less populated, and north was where I had the most familiarity with the roads, having driven them for clients for the last 3 years. North meant empty stretches between small towns, agricultural land, places where a bus could move without being surrounded. I didn't have a plan beyond that. North, and keep moving, and see what was true. I picked up Patty 3 days later. I was coming through a town called Rib Falls, which is not a town so much as a few hundred people arranged along a state highway with a gas station and a feed store and a diner called something I can't remember anymore. The highway was empty, except for 3 cars pulled over on the shoulder at odd angles. Not accident angles, just angles that said someone had stopped in a hurry and gotten out and not come back. Patty was standing on the roof of a hardware store. She'd climbed up a fire escape and pulled the ladder up after her. She had a camping pack, and what looked like a rifle case, and she was waving at me with something orange. A road flare, already burned down to nothing, just the stub of it with the striker end. I stopped the bus. She looked at the bus for a long moment, then at me in the driver's window. Then she said, in a voice like she was asking for directions to the bathroom at a department store, "Can I get a ride?" I said, "How long have you been up there?" She said, "About 2 days." "I had a situation." I said, "What's in the case?" She said, "A rifle. It was my husband's. I shot it, maybe 6 times in my life, but I'm motivated." I said, "Is there anything else around that I should know about before I open the door?" She looked behind her at the street I couldn't see from my angle. There were 4 of them over by the gas station about an hour ago. I don't know where they went. I said, "What were they doing?" She said, "Standing there mostly." Then one of them walked into the door of the gas station and fell over and didn't get up, and the others just kind of wandered into the road and kept going. I thought about that. Then I said, "Okay, come to the far end of the roof, the south end, and climb down. I'll pull up so you're stepping onto the bus roof. Try to do it fast." She nodded like this was a reasonable plan, which she later told me is her general approach to things that need to happen regardless of how unreasonable they are. She'd been a school principal for 22 years, and her philosophy, developed over decades of dealing with children and parents and school boards and budget cuts and all the various forms of chaos those things produce, was that most situations improve if you just do the next thing without stopping to feel bad about it first. I pulled the bus forward while she climbed down. She stepped onto the roof from the edge of the hardware store, found her footing. She was heavier than her voice had suggested, solid and practical looking, in her early 50s, with short gray hair, and the kind of face that's been outside in Wisconsin for a long time. And I watched in the mirror as she made her way across the roof to the emergency hatch, which I'd already unlocked from inside. She came down through the hatch, pulled it shut behind her, and stood in the aisle looking around at what the interior of the bus looked like now. She said, "This is more than I expected." I said, "Get seated." "I need to move." She sat. I moved. We didn't say much else for about an hour because I was concentrating, and she was doing something with her camping pack, taking stock of what was in it. Eventually she said, "Patty Bowman. I was the principal at Rib Falls Elementary for 12 years. I said, "Dennis Holt. I own the bus." She said, "I noticed the welding, on the windows, on the door frame." I said, "Yeah." She said, "It's good welding." I said, "Thank you." She said, "Did you do it before or after?" I said, "Mostly before." There was a pause, and I could feel her deciding something about me. Then she said, "Smart man," and went back to her pack inventory. That was Patty. Patty has a bad knee from a basketball injury 30 years ago, and she doesn't mention it unless the situation specifically requires it, which I've learned means she's in fairly consistent pain that she's simply decided not to allocate time to. She is the most practically useful person I have met in my life, not excepting anyone I worked with for 18 years in county maintenance. She knows first aid at a level that approaches clinical. She's not a medical professional, but she raised 3 kids and spent 22 years in a building full of other people's children, and she's dealt with every injury short of surgical. She's calm in a way that doesn't feel performed, and she's honest without being brutal about it, which is rarer than people think. I'm glad I stopped for her. That sounds obvious, but at the time, stopping for anyone was a calculation, and I want to be clear that I did the calculation. I stopped for Patty because she was visibly alone, visibly competent, and visibly not panicked, and those 3 things together outweighed the risk of stopping in a town I didn't know. Roger came on the 4th day after Patty. I say this plainly, but the actual situation was not plain. It was complicated in ways I didn't understand until much later. We'd stopped at a quick trip outside of Merrill to fuel up. I'd found fuel at the first 2 stops by using a hand pump from the underground tank. The station power was out, but the fuel was still there, and this stop was the same. I had a set of pump adapters I'd put together before leaving Madison, One of the things I'd thought to add because I'd spent enough time around fleet vehicles to know that underground fuel storage doesn't disappear just because the electricity does. I was running the pump, and Patty was inside the store taking stock of what was left on the shelves. Not a lot. Someone had been through recently. But there were some things that had been overlooked. A few cans on the bottom shelves that looked like whatever brand people avoid when they have other options. When Roger ran across the parking lot from the direction of the road. He was maybe 29, 28, thin in a way that suggested recent stress rather than constitution, wearing jeans and a flannel shirt that had a significant tear on the left shoulder. He was moving fast, which was the first thing I noticed, and he was looking behind him, which was the second. I said, "Stop." He stopped, looked at me. "Are you alone in there?" I said, "No. What's behind you?" He said, "Nothing. I mean, not those things. Not infected. A truck. I lost them like 2 miles back, but I don't know for how long." I said, "Who's in the truck?" He said, "People who..." "Okay, I need to be in that bus." I said, "That's not an answer." He said, "People who want what I have," which honestly isn't much, but they don't know that. I looked behind him at the road. Empty. I looked at him. He had the kind of face that's bad at lying, too expressive, the anxiety showing in all the wrong places. Whatever he was scared of it for real. I said, "You go in the front door. You sit where I can see you in the mirror. You put both hands in your lap." He said, "Yeah, absolutely." He went in. Patty came back from the store with 2 bags of items that she handed to me without comment. Then she looked at Roger sitting in the 3rd row seat with his hands folded in his lap like a first grader, and she said, "New passenger?" I said, "Apparently." She looked at him. "Are you hurt?" He said, "No." She said, "Good. What's your name?" He said, "Roger Tull." She nodded and went to the back of the bus to stow the supplies. Roger watched her go and then looked at me, and I said, "What truck?" He said, "There's a group moving around in the area between here and the interstate. 3 vehicles, 2 pickup trucks and an SUV. They've been collecting, I don't know, people, supplies, vehicles, not collecting nicely." I said, "How long were you with them?" He looked at the floor. 2 weeks. I joined up because it seemed like the better option at the time. It became clear that it wasn't. I said, "What do you have that they want?" He said, "I have a map." I looked at him. He said, "I know how that sounds, but it's a specific map. I had a job. Before, I mean. I was doing survey work for a contractor who was building an energy pipeline up through central Wisconsin. The pipeline isn't built yet, obviously, but the survey maps are very detailed. Infrastructure routes, property access roads, agricultural service roads that aren't on any public map, where fuel storage tanks are, where there's generator infrastructure, stuff like that." I said, "You have this map on you?" He said, "In my head mostly. Some of it." He tapped his temple. "The rest is on a tablet that I've kept charged. The group. They know about the map. A guy named Frank told them about it. I didn't know Frank before all this, but he knew about my work. I don't know how, and he made it sound like I'd committed to staying with them." I said, "Did you?" He said, "Not in a way that I agreed to." I thought about that. Then I said, "If those roads are as useful as you're saying, you're an asset." He said, "Yeah, that's the problem." I finished fueling, got back in the driver's seat. Roger's information about the survey maps turned out to be genuinely useful. It took about a week before I fully trusted it, but he knew access roads and maintenance routes that had no public presence. And more than once that information got us through or around something that would have otherwise been impassable. His connection to Frank's group, whoever Frank was, became a different problem, one that didn't resolve cleanly. I should say something about the infected before I go further, because I've been avoiding it in a way that isn't honest. The infected are not what movies made me think they'd be. Or, they're some of what movies made me think, but not in the way I pictured. In movies, the infected are a very specific kind of awful. Fast-moving, smart-looking, like something with intent behind it. The infected I saw in those first weeks were not like that at all. They moved. That's the primary thing about them. They moved constantly. Walking, mostly. That slow, poorly coordinated walk that doesn't look like a human walk even from a distance. Something wrong in the hip joints. Something that's not processing the ground surface correctly. That's just pushing forward regardless of footing. I saw one of them walk off a curb and go down hard on its face and get back up without any adjustment to its behavior. No flinch. No changed pace. Just back up and forward. They moved toward sound. This was the most consistent thing I observed, and it took me a while to accept how completely true it was. If you sat still, they mostly ignored you, or rather, didn't find you. They weren't searching. They weren't hunting in any strategic sense. They were just moving toward sound. If I idled the engine too long in one place, they would start drifting toward the bus from whatever direction they came from, and the drift would accelerate as more of them oriented to the noise, and the collective movement created more noise and more orientation. If I killed the engine and everyone in the bus stayed perfectly still and quiet, they would walk past the bus without reacting, provided the bus wasn't directly in their path. If it was directly in their path, they walked into it, not around it, into it. That's where the thuds came from. They didn't try doors. They couldn't climb. I confirmed this the hard way once, when 3 of them were at the front of the bus, and I'd had to move quickly, and one of them walked into the access ladder on the side of the bus, the fold-down ladder for roof access, and it didn't occur to it, as far as I could tell, to put its foot on the first rung. It just pressed against the ladder until the ladder cut into its shoulder, and then kept pressing. They bit. This is the part that was exactly like the movies, and there's no way to say it differently, so I'm saying it plainly. They bit. Given the opportunity, they bit. And the bite was infectious, in a timeline that ranged from a few hours to, from what I observed, as much as 2 days. I don't know why there was a range. I didn't ask anyone who might know, because anyone who might know was either dead or out of reach, and the practical information, that you needed to avoid being bitten, was already available from the observable data. They didn't die from damage the way a human would die from damage. This was the part that required the most recalibration of my thinking. Not that they were superhuman, or that bullets didn't work. Bullets worked fine, and so did other things. It was more that the normal signals weren't there. A badly injured one didn't slow down proportionally to the injury. A broken leg didn't stop it, just changed its locomotion in ways that sometimes made it more erratic and harder to predict. The head was the functional problem, and I'll leave it there. The smell was something I had no frame of reference for. It wasn't like death, exactly. It was more like something that had been very much alive and was now running on the wrong fuel. Something almost sweet, underneath something else, that was definitely not sweet. I don't have a better description than that, and I've thought about it. There were a lot of them. Within the first week outside of Madison, I was seeing them in numbers that told me something about how fast this had moved through the population. Not everywhere. There were stretches of road where there were none at all, and then a town where there were hundreds. The inconsistency was initially confusing, and then, after I thought about it, made sense. Some towns had been hit early, and the infected had largely dispersed outward in search of sound. Some towns had been hit later, and the infected were still concentrated. The pattern wasn't random, it was sequential, following population density and road networks, but it was hard to map in real time from the driver's seat of a bus. The bus, with its weight and its rebuilt door, and its window grills and the ram on the front, was adequate for what the infected represented as a threat. They weren't a complex threat. The complex threat, as Roger had told me from his experience with Frank's group, was people. I learned that lesson completely and permanently about 3 weeks in. The stop where I learned it was a town called Holcomb, which I won't describe in detail because describing it in detail doesn't seem right. I'll say that there was a group of maybe 8 people who had set up in what had been a grocery store, and they initially appeared to be exactly what you'd want to find. Organized, calm, apparently well supplied. I stopped because I needed to check something on the rear axle that had been making a sound I didn't like, and because Colleen, who I hadn't found yet, was being held in that grocery store. I didn't know the second part when I stopped. I found it out after. The people in the Holcomb grocery were operating on a system. The system was that if you had something they wanted, you could trade for supplies or information. If you didn't have something they wanted, you were still welcome to stay. The language they used was part of the community, which felt like a phrase someone had workshopped. But the terms of your stay would be determined based on what you could contribute going forward, and the determination of what you could contribute was made by a man named Arthur, who was very calm and very reasonable sounding, in a way that I found instantly suspicious. Arthur was probably 55, small guy, glasses, the kind of thinning hair that someone has combed very carefully for decades out of habit. He wore a button-down shirt that was cleaner than it had any right to be. He was friendly in the practiced way of someone who has spent a long time in a profession where you need people to trust you before they understand what you're offering them. I didn't trust him before I understood what he was offering. I just didn't like him on a gut level, which I've learned to treat as data rather than rudeness. I said I was there to check my rear axle and I'd be back on the road within the hour. He said, of course, absolutely. And he'd have some people bring some food for my passengers while I worked. Just basic hospitality, he said, which is a phrase that shouldn't make me uncomfortable, but did. I said that was fine. I didn't eat anything they brought. Patty ate some of it. Roger didn't. His experience with Frank's group had calibrated him on certain things. While I was under the rear of the bus, I heard something from the building next to the grocery, what had been a dollar store of some kind. Specifically, I heard a sound from a window on the second floor. A small sound, almost like nothing, like someone pressing the flat of their hand against glass. I looked up at the window. Nothing there. I went back to the axle. 20 minutes later I heard it again, a little louder, and I looked up again and I saw a hand, just a hand, pressed against the inside of the window glass. A young hand. It went away fast when I looked, like whoever was there didn't want to be seen looking. I finished with the axle. It was what I'd thought. A worn bearing carrier that I could live with for a while longer but needed to watch. And I went back to the bus and got inside and told Patty, quietly, what I'd seen. She looked at me. Then she looked at the grocery store. Then she said, "What do you want to do?" I said, "I want to get whoever's in that window onto the bus." She said, "How?" I said, "Give me a minute." What I did was this. I told Arthur that I needed a part from a lumber yard I'd seen about a half-mile back. A specific hardware item. A bolt size I described in enough detail to sound credible, which wasn't hard because I know hardware. And I asked if he'd come show me exactly where the lumber yard was because I wasn't sure I'd remembered the right building. Arthur came with me. While Arthur was gone and the other people in the group were occupied with whatever they occupied themselves with, Patty went into the dollar store and found the stairs to the second floor and found Colleen. Colleen was 16, which I found out later. She'd been in Holcomb when the outbreak hit, because she'd been visiting a friend, and the friend's family hadn't made it. Arthur's group had found her, and she wasn't being mistreated exactly, but the terms of her stay had been explained to her in a way that had made her want to put her hand against a window the moment she saw someone who looked like they might be leaving. Patty got her to the bus. I got back to the bus at roughly the same time, having successfully led Arthur to the lumber yard, and then said I needed the wrong part and would have to come back later, which Arthur accepted with complete pleasantness and zero belief. We left Holcomb immediately. I didn't look back at the grocery store, and I don't know if Arthur came out to watch us go. Colleen didn't say much for the first 2 days. She sat in the seat behind me, and she read books. She'd grabbed 3 from a shelf in the dollar store before Patty brought her out, and she responded to direct questions with short answers. She ate when food was offered. She slept a lot, which I think was her body running a debt. On the 3rd day, she said, "Where are we going?" I said, "North and west, looking for somewhere with fuel and some cover, and I want to get away from the interstate corridors." She said, "I looked at your map." I said, "Yeah?" She said, "There's an industrial area north of Eau Claire. It's got a rail yard and what looks like a distribution depot." I said, "What about it?" She said, "Rail yards have diesel storage. Distribution depots have loading bays with freight that nobody's had time to come get." I looked at her in the rearview mirror. She looked back at me with an expression that said this was just logistics, nothing surprising about knowing this. I said, "How'd you figure that?" She said, "My dad drove a semi. I used to sit in the cab with him when I was little." He explained all of it. I said, "Where is your dad?" She said, "Minneapolis." She went back to her book. I didn't ask a follow-up question because the particular way she said Minneapolis was a complete answer. Walt Durbin joined us on the 7th day after Colleen, and Walt is the most complicated thing about this whole story, so I want to be careful about how I describe him. I found Walt in a car on the side of the road, not a stopped-at-an-odd-angle car, a parked car, parked correctly, nose to the curb, driver's side facing the road, windows up. There was a man in the driver's seat who was not moving, and I thought he was dead. I stopped the bus about 30 yards back, got out with the 357 in my hand, and walked up to the car. The man in the driver's seat had his chin on his chest and his hands in his lap, and when I rapped on the window, he jerked awake like someone waking from a car nap, which is exactly what it was. He was 61 or 62, heavy-set in a settled way, white hair that needed a cut, reading glasses on a cord around his neck. He looked at me, then at the gun in my hand, then at the bus behind me. He rolled the window down. He said, "Is that roadworthy?" I said, "Yes." He said, "Are you taking passengers?" I said, "Who are you?" He said his name was Walt Durbin, that he'd been a contracts manager for a biomedical company for the past 8 years before that, and that he'd left Chicago 11 days ago when it became clear the city was not going to stabilize and that staying was going to get him killed. He'd been driving north on back roads because the main routes were impassable, and he'd run out of gas 2 days ago. He'd been living in the car since then. I said, "What's in the briefcase?" He looked at the back seat, where there was a hard-sided attaché case, not the soft laptop kind, the old-fashioned kind, with combination locks, that he'd apparently been treating carefully enough that it was the first thing he'd established in the car before going to sleep. He said, "Work documents." I said, "What kind of work documents?" He said, "The kind that need to get somewhere safe." I stood there for a second. The road was empty in both directions. The afternoon was quiet, except for birds. There were always birds, I'd noticed. The birds were completely indifferent to all of this, and something I couldn't identify, a low sound from the north that might have been wind. I said, "You can come aboard. The briefcase comes too. It stays locked. You don't show me what's in it unless you decide you want to." He said, "That's reasonable." He said that a lot. That's reasonable. It's a phrase I've come to associate with him specifically. Walt was not a useful person in practical survival terms. He couldn't do mechanical work, couldn't do construction, couldn't navigate particularly well, wasn't particularly physical. What he could do was think clearly under pressure, in a way that I found useful, and he knew things about how supply chains and infrastructure worked that occasionally provided information I needed. He was also, I discovered, good at staying calm in situations that made other people do things that were loud or expensive. That's worth something. But the briefcase was a problem. Not immediately, but eventually. The first strange thing happened about 4 days after I found Walt. We were in a stretch of highway between 2 small towns. Nothing for miles in either direction. Farmland, late afternoon. Sky, the kind of overcast gray that Wisconsin does for most of the year. I was driving, Walt was in his seat, Patty was in the back with Colleen, and Roger was in the rear lounge area doing something with his survey map tablet. I noticed the infected on both sides of the road as we came around a long bend. Maybe 30 of them on the right, 20 or so on the left, spread out across a cornfield that had gone completely unharvested. The stalks were still standing, dry and brown, and the infected were among the stalks in no particular formation, just standing and moving in small random increments. And then we crossed what I can only describe as a line in the road, though there was no actual line. No painted line, no change in the pavement surface, no guardrail, no road sign. We crossed it. I know we crossed it because of what happened next, which was that the infected, the ones close to the road's edge, stopped. Not fell over. not got distracted by something, stopped. They stopped walking and stood there. The ones that had been moving between the stalks stopped. Not all at once. There was a ripple effect to it, like they each got to a point and just quit. And they stayed that way as I watched them in the rearview mirror, growing smaller, not resuming whatever random motion they'd been doing. I said, without taking my eyes off the road, "Did anyone else see that?" "Roger, from the back. The cornfield ones?" "Yeah." They stopped. They stopped. Patty came up the aisle from the rear. She'd been watching too. She stood by my seat and looked back at the field through the side mirror, and for a long moment neither of us said anything. Walt said, very quietly, "How far back do you estimate that was?" I said, "About 3/10 of a mile." He said, "Note the highway marker." I looked for a marker and found one. 54.6, the route number and distance post. I noted it. Walt said, "That's reasonable." And that was all he said about it. We drove back through the same stretch of road 2 days later, going back east to check a fuel source Roger had noted on his tablet. We came through from the other direction this time. The infected were still in the cornfield, still clustered to the east of that invisible point. When we drove past them, same thing. They stopped. Same general point in the road, same stopping behavior. No sound, no warning, just a sudden cessation. I've driven through that stretch 3 more times since then. Same result every time. I don't know what it is. I've looked at the ground. I've walked the area on foot twice. I've checked for anything in the road surface or at the shoulder. Some kind of chemical treatment or something buried. Nothing obvious. The soil on the west side looks the same as the soil on the east side. The air smells the same. I have a theory about electromagnetic interference from something below ground. There's old mining history in that part of Wisconsin, old mineral deposits. But I can't prove it, and I might be wrong, and I've decided that I don't need to understand something to be glad it exists. Colleen calls it the fence. I don't think that's the right word for something with no visible physical component, but I understand what she means by it, and I've started using the word too. The industrial area north of Eau Claire was everything Colleen had predicted from the map and more. Specifically, the rail yard, an active freight hub before the outbreak, now abandoned mid-operation, with 8 freight trains parked on various sidings at various stages of whatever they'd been doing when everything stopped, had fuel. The rail yard's fuel depot held the bulk diesel for the locomotives, 2 above-ground tanks with a combined capacity that I estimated at around 40,000 gallons, and most of it was still there. The fill connections were different from road vehicle connections, but a universal coupling adapter on my pump kit handled 2 of the 3 connection types, and I spent a day fabricating a coupling for the third. We filled the bus to the brim, filled every external auxiliary container I had. I also found 4 55-gallon drums in a maintenance shed, loaded them onto the roof rack with some improvised tie-down rigging, and filled those too. The roof rack took the weight, barely, and I adjusted the rear air suspension pressure to compensate. Then we went through the freight trains. What was on those trains was largely a matter of luck, or fate, or whatever you want to call the particular way the world arranges itself sometimes. 7 of the 8 trains were bulk agricultural freight. Grain cars, mostly, sealed hoppers full of corn and soybeans that were technically food, but not in any form I could do much with without milling equipment. The 8th train was an intermodal freight container cars, 40-foot and 53-foot containers, a mix of whatever had been heading wherever. We spent 3 days going through the containers. The first container we opened had automotive parts, useful for nothing we needed specifically. The second had bulk coffee, whole bean, 100-pound burlap sacks, maybe 40 of them. I stood in that container for a few seconds after we got the door open. Patty said, "Oh, thank God," in a tone that suggested she hadn't realized until that moment how much she'd been missing it. The third had canned goods. Commercial quantity, restaurant supply grade, cans the size of paint cans, labels for tomatoes and beans and corn and chicken broth and diced chilies and a dozen other things. We could not take all of it. We didn't have space. But we took what we could carry. and I made notes on the container's location and identifier number because I intended to come back. The fourth had paper products, which sounds pointless, but is not. Toilet paper, paper towels, bleached white paper in quantity, which is useful for a lot of things. I took what fit. The fifth had medical supplies. Actual medical supplies. This one I had to breathe for a moment when the door came open, because inside were pallet-wrapped boxes of IV bags, sterile dressing kits, disposable gloves in quantity, syringes, and several items I couldn't immediately identify, but that Walt looked at and said were standard hospital supply goods. Anesthetics, IV antibiotics in powder form, blood pressure equipment, a portable defibrillator. I said, "Walt, how do you know what those are?" He said, "I managed procurement contracts for biomedical supply for 8 years." I said, "That's a weird coincidence." He said, "Yes." That was the conversation. I looked at him for a moment longer than the moment required, and he looked back at me with the expression he uses when he's aware I'm thinking something he isn't going to address. I took everything I could manage from the medical container. Some of it I didn't know how to use, the IV bags, the powder antibiotics. But Patty knew more than I did, and between us, we cataloged it and stored it, and agreed that having it was better than not having it regardless. The 6th through 8th containers we opened had textiles, electronic equipment, useless without power infrastructure, and what appeared to be a large quantity of cosmetics in retail packaging, which Colleen found darkly funny. We stayed at the rail yard for 11 days in total, the longest I'd been in one place since leaving Madison. I spent the time making improvements that the road hadn't allowed me to make. Additional structural welding on the bus frame, some repairs to the front ram mount that had taken more stress than designed from a hard push through an intersection 2 weeks earlier, and a significant rebuild of the rear suspension that I'd been deferring. Roger spent the time with his survey tablet, updating his mental maps and the digital ones with everything he'd learned over the past weeks. He knew the back roads like he'd grown up on them, which I think was the one thing about Roger that was completely real, unfiltered by whatever else was complicated about him. He loved those roads. He'd ridden them in survey trucks for 2 years before the outbreak, and he knew the soil types and the culvert sizes, and where the weight-restricted bridges were, and where the private farm roads crossed each other in ways that didn't appear on any commercial map. If you needed to get somewhere without using a state highway, Roger was what you needed. Colleen got a hunting rifle out of a case she found in a maintenance supervisor's office at the rail yard. She already knew how to shoot. Her father had taken her to a range since she was 12, and she was better at it than any of us, which was not something I'd anticipated when a teenager was the one carrying the rifle. She spent time each morning and evening taking single shots at specific targets she set up around the perimeter, not at infected, just at cans and pieces of reflective tape, and she didn't miss often. I asked her once why she practiced so deliberately when ammo was something we were careful about. She said, "Because missing wastes more than a bullet." I didn't argue with that. Patty organized the food supply. This is a thing she did thoroughly, and the word organized doesn't capture the level of it. She inventoried. She cataloged. She created a rotation system based on expiration dates. She calculated caloric values against our group of 4 adults and 1 teenager, and produced a daily ration guideline that she posted on the partition behind the driver's seat, using a piece of tape and a handwritten page from a spiral notebook. The guideline was not harsh. We had enough, particularly after the train find. But it was specific. 800 calories per meal, 2 meals per day, with a third light meal of whatever Patty deemed excess from the rotation. She adjusted it periodically based on inventory and output. On days when I was doing heavy physical work, she added a third full meal without being asked, because she'd noticed that the quality of my work was degraded when I was running low. I noticed her noticing things like this. I didn't say much about it. It was one of the better experiences of the previous year that someone was paying that kind of attention. We didn't talk about the railroad yard to anyone outside the bus, but within about 4 days of arriving there, other survivors started appearing. Not groups, individuals or pairs. People moving through the area who saw the bus and stopped and stood at a respectful distance and waited to see what happened. I talked to most of them. I gave food to some of them. I asked all of them what they knew, where they'd come from, what they'd seen, which roads were clear and which were impassable, which towns had activity and which were empty. This was information gathering, not charity, though the information and the food became difficult to separate after a while. I did not invite anyone new onto the bus during this period. The group was Roger, Patty, Colleen, Walt, and me, and I was not ready to change that. Walt said that was a sensible decision. Colleen didn't say anything about it. Roger seemed actively relieved. Patty asked me on day 8 of the rail yard stay whether I felt okay about not inviting anyone. I said, "Define okay." She said, "Do you think about it at night?" I said, "I think about a lot of things at night." She said, "That's not an answer." I said, "Yeah, I feel okay about it." She looked at me with the look she uses when she's decided not to push something. I've seen that look on the faces of people who've spent a long time managing large groups of humans. It's not judgment exactly. It's a kind of patience. Like she knows something will come around eventually, and she's prepared to wait. I moved the bus out of the rail yard on a Sunday morning, or what I'm calling Sunday. The calendar accuracy is rough by this point, and we went west. Roger's survey information suggested a clear corridor that avoided the main cities. I drove with the window cracked because I'd started needing the fresh air and the road sound to stay alert. The engine sound under everything else was constant and familiar, and by this point, I'd been listening to it for so long that the changes registered automatically. The way you stop noticing a sound in a room until it changes, and then you notice the change instantly. The bearing carrier I'd flagged in my head weeks earlier was now making a sound that had changed character. Not dramatically, but enough. I added it to the list of things that needed attention at the next stop, long enough to work on it. I should have moved it higher on the list. I didn't, and that decision mattered. The highway anomaly that I found happened a second time 2 weeks after the first. But this time, it was different. We were moving through a section of state highway that I'd been on once before, going the other way. Coming from the west this time. The road curved north, through a stretch of scrub pine and second-growth woods, before opening onto more farmland. I knew the fence was around here somewhere, because I'd marked the area on my paper road map with a small X. We came through the woods and onto the farmland stretch, and there they were. But not in a cornfield this time. The road through this section had a small town in it. A village, really. Maybe 40 buildings, a grain elevator, a church, a tavern, a post office. And every infected person I could see was dressed formally. I mean everyone. Men in suit jackets and slacks. Women in dresses, some in what looked like floor-length formal gowns, several of them with boutonnieres or what had been boutonnieres. A few in what might have been church clothes or what might have been wedding clothes. The colors were wrong for wedding clothes. Darker, more subdued, but the level of formality was the same. There were maybe 60 of them spread through the village, moving in that particular directionless way along the main street and into and out of the buildings, and they were all dressed like they'd been at a significant event. I slowed the bus to about 10 miles per hour to go through the village. No one spoke for the whole stretch. Colleen had her face pressed close to the window glass. Not afraid. Close. Just looking hard. Roger was at the back, watching through the rear window. Walt sat with his hands in his lap, looking forward at nothing in particular. When we cleared the village and the road opened up again, Patty said, "Some kind of gathering." I said, "Looks like." She said, "Funeral maybe, or a wedding." The church was the biggest building. Colleen said, "Some of them had corsages." Nobody said anything for a while. I was thinking about a town where everyone got sick at a gathering. Everyone dressed for something important, and then not everyone making it home. The obvious sadness of the image was sitting in the bus with us, and nobody wanted to be the first to say it out loud, so nobody did. Walt said very quietly, "The infection spread quickly in closed spaces. Public gatherings were effective vectors." I said, "Yeah." He said, "Weddings, funerals, town meetings, holiday gatherings." The timing was, it coincided with a period when large gatherings were happening. I said, what timing specifically? He said, the spring was a peak season for gatherings, memorial services, graduation ceremonies, that sort of thing. I looked at him in the rearview mirror. He was looking at his hands. I said, Walt. He said, yes. I said, what's in the briefcase? He was quiet for a long time, long enough that the road had changed around us, the scrub pine coming back on both sides, the daylight going that particular late afternoon amber. He said, documents. I said, you said that before. What kind? He said, internal correspondence, supply chain records, some laboratory documentation. I said, from where? He said, from Mervyn Biotech. I looked at him in the rearview mirror. He was still looking at his hands. I said, Walt. He said, I know. I said, what do you know? He said, I know what you're thinking. I was contracts manager. That's all I was. I managed vendor relationships and supply agreements, and I knew the broad outlines of what they were working on in terms of product lines, not the specifics, but I knew there were problems, liability problems that someone had decided to manage rather than address. I said, what does manage mean? He said, it means that information about those problems went to a very small group of people and stayed there, and the product continued to move. I said, what product? He said, a bovine growth hormone modification. Agricultural use. It went to commercial livestock operations, thousands of facilities in an 18-state area. I pulled the bus over onto the shoulder of the road and stopped it. The engine was idling. Everyone in the bus was very still. I said, Walt. He said, I know, Colleen said, from the seat behind mine, very carefully. You're saying it came from the food supply. Walt said, I'm saying it may have originated from a product distributed into the food supply. I am not a scientist. I don't know the mechanism. I know what the documents show, which is that there were adverse behavioral observations in test animals that were not reported to the regulatory agencies, and that when the product went to commercial use, those observations appeared in different form, in a subset of the human population, in the form of what was initially diagnosed as a neurological illness. The bus was quiet except for the engine. Roger said, from the back, Frank's group. Frank knew about Mervyn Biotech. Walt turned in his seat to look at Roger. Roger said, he talked about it. Not specifically, but he said there were people who knew things that they needed to be kept away from, people who had information. Walt said, that would explain some things. I said, Walt, the briefcase. He said, yes. I said, is it proof? He said, very quietly, it's enough to be proof, with the right context and the right people to interpret it. I said, is there anyone left in the right position to do that? He said, I don't know. That's why I need to get it somewhere safe. I sat in the driver's seat for probably 3 minutes, just sitting, engine idling, the woods on both sides, and the empty road ahead. Then I put the bus in gear and drove. I didn't say anything else about the briefcase for 10 days. Neither did Walt. The information sat with all of us in the bus, the way information does when it's too big to do anything with immediately. It changed the texture of everything, without changing any specific thing, and eventually, the day-to-day survival work buried it under enough hours that it receded to a background frequency that I noticed, without dwelling on. But I thought about Mervyn Biotech, the pharmaceutical charter I'd driven the previous November, the woman at the gas pump in March, the man on the bus watching news on his phone. I thought about all the places the thing had touched before it became what it was, and how long it had been moving before anyone was in a position to do anything about it. And I did the exercise that I usually try not to do, of imagining the decision that someone had made, in a meeting room, in an office, in a call between two people with a lot to protect, to keep going rather than stop. I try not to do that exercise, not because it isn't useful, but because what it produces in me is something that makes me a worse driver, a worse decision maker, a worse person to be in a small enclosed space with. I'm angry in a particular way about it that I don't know what to do with. So I drive. Month 2. is where the story gets harder to tell in sequence, because the days started blurring together in a way that the first month hadn't. The first month had the clarity of novelty. Everything was new. Every decision was made for the first time. Month 2 was repetition and wear, and the harder work of maintaining not just the bus, but the people in it. The bearing carrier I'd been watching finally let go on a Thursday afternoon, or what I was calling Thursday, about 70 miles west of the rail yard. The sound it had been making for 6 weeks changed to something I recognized immediately as wrong, and I had maybe 90 seconds between when I recognized it and when the bus started pulling hard to the right. I got it to a stop on the shoulder of a county road before it went completely, which was luck and experience in roughly equal measure. The bearing itself was shot. The carrier housing had cracked, which was more expensive in terms of repair time. I had a spare bearing. I'd had the foresight to carry spare bearings for the front and rear axles when I prepped the bus, because I'm the kind of mechanic who hears the specific sound of a dying bearing in his sleep. But the cracked carrier meant I had to fabricate a repair rather than a replacement. I was under the bus for 4 hours while Patty watched the road and Roger and Colleen handled the perimeter. The temperature was probably 55 degrees and the ground was cold, and I had about 2/3 of the range of motion in my left shoulder that I normally have, because I'd strained it doing something stupid with the roof rack 2 weeks earlier, and the repair was tight and required getting my arm into a position that the shoulder objected to. Walt sat in the bus, and I could hear him moving around inside, which was fine, and at some point he came out and stood next to the bus and handed me a wrench that I needed without me having to ask for it, which surprised me, and he said, "Will it hold?" I said, "Long enough." He said, "Long enough for what?" I said, "Long enough to get to somewhere I can do it right." He said, "That's reasonable." I said, "Walt." He said, "Yes." I said, "Did you know, before, that it was going to be what it became?" He didn't answer for a while. I kept working. The sound of the wrench on the bolt was the only sound on the road for a stretch. He said, "I knew something was wrong. I knew it wasn't being handled correctly. I didn't know what wrong meant at the scale it turned out to mean." I said, "Did you tell anyone?" He said, "I started compiling the documents when I realized I should have told someone earlier and hadn't." I said, "When was that?" He said, "March." I said, "Before it went public?" He said, "Yes." I came out from under the bus and looked at him. He looked back at me. He was the same as always, clean-looking despite everything, careful, that expression of assessed reasonableness. I said, "I don't know what to do with what you told me." He said, "I know." I said, "I'm not going to throw you off the bus." He said, "I know." I said, "But I need you to understand that I'm angry." He said, "I know that too." I got back under the bus. The repair took another hour. It held, and it's still holding, which is something I've thought about more than seems proportional to an axle bearing. The first direct encounter with Frank's group happened on a Tuesday, in what I'm estimating was the 7th week after leaving Madison. It could be the 6th week or the 8th, but it was somewhere in that range, and the day of the week is approximate as well. We were on a county road about 40 miles from where Roger had said the back roads started thinning out, where the survey territory he knew well gave way to roads he knew less well, and things would get more uncertain. I had a plan to stop at a property he'd flagged on his tablet, a former agricultural cooperative storage facility that might have propane and possibly some canned goods from whatever the last season's operation had been. The truck came from behind us. I saw it in the driver's mirror while I was still maybe a mile from the cooperative. A full-size pickup, dark blue or black, moving fast on the road we'd come in on. I said, "Roger," and didn't have to say anything else. Roger said, from behind me, "I see it." I increased my speed. Not dramatically, because the road had some curves, and I didn't want to push the bus past what the repair I'd done would confidently handle. But I went from about 45 to 55. The truck increased its speed too. It was making up ground. I said, "Colleen, back window." She was already there. I heard the snick of the rifle bolt. Patty came forward and sat in the front passenger seat, which she uses when she needs to keep my field of view clear and handle logistics. She said, "What do you want to do?" I said, "Get to the cooperative. I want weight under us and a building to use as cover." The truck was maybe a quarter-mile back now. I could see it was a single cab with a figure in the bed, someone in the back, which meant 2 people total, and someone was watching the bus from behind. Roger said, "Frank doesn't send just 2. I said, "More coming?" He said, "If that's Frank's, they'll have a second vehicle somewhere, coming from the other direction probably." I said, "How would they know what direction we're going?" He said, "They've been tracking us for a week." I didn't want to say anything until I was sure. I looked at him in the mirror. He had the expression of someone who's been carrying something and waiting for the right moment to put it down. I said, "We're going to have a conversation about that later." He said, "Yeah." The cooperative appeared ahead on the left, a large corrugated metal building, 2 silos, a gravel lot, fencing. I turned in and drove straight to the far side of the main building, putting it between us and the road. The gravel crunched loud under the tires, and I slowed to a stop and killed the engine. Silence. The building was between us and whoever was on the road. Colleen said, "The truck stopped at the road, not turning in." I said, "Good. That means they're deciding." Roger said, "There'll be a second truck coming from the east within the next 10 or 15 minutes. I said, "How do you know?" He said, "Because I've seen them do it before. They've done it to 3 other groups that I know about. 1 truck from the rear to push you forward, 1 from the front to stop you. Then they get out and have a conversation." Patty said, "What kind of conversation?" Roger said, "The kind that ends with them taking your vehicle and your supplies and you walking." I got out of the bus and walked to the corner of the building and looked around the edge at the road. The pickup was idling at the entrance to the gravel lot, 60 or 70 yards back. The figure in the bed was standing up, watching. I walked back to the bus, got in, sat in the driver's seat for a moment. I said, "I want to move before the second truck arrives." Patty said, "Back the way we came?" I said, "They'd follow us from the rear, and the second truck would intercept." Roger said, "There's a field road about 300 yards north of here, goes west for about a mile, then picks up a track that connects to the county highway network. It's soft ground, but it's passable for a vehicle this weight." I said, "You're sure?" He said, "I surveyed it. Summer before last. It was dry enough then. I don't know what it is now." I thought about that. Bus, 54,000 pounds, soft ground. The tires were good for the purpose. I was running 295/80 all-position tires with good lugs. But soft ground, with a vehicle this heavy in spring conditions, was a real problem. I said, "What's the alternative if we can't make the field road?" Roger said, "Keep going west on the main road and hope the second truck isn't there yet." I said, "Give me a minute." I went back to the corner of the building and looked again. The pickup was still at the road entrance, not moving, waiting. I went back to the bus and I drove north along the fence line of the cooperative property, slowly, looking for the field road Roger had described. I found it, barely more than 2 wheel tracks in the grass, already showing some green growth. I got out and walked it for about 50 yards, testing the ground with my foot, feeling the way it compressed. It was soft, not saturated, not standing water, but soft in the way that says it'll firm up 6 inches down, but those 6 inches are going to be a problem. I walked back to the bus and looked at Roger. He said, "I know." I said, "I've done worse." He said, "Okay." I said, "Get to a seat. Hang on to something. If we start to settle, I'm going to accelerate, and you do not want to be standing when that happens." He sat. Everyone else was already seated. I looked at Patty, who was looking back at me with the expression that means she thinks this is a reasonable risk given the alternatives, and she'll say so if I'm wrong. I said, "Here we go." I turned the bus onto the field road. The first 80 yards were fine. The grass and the packed wheel track from Roger's survey truck gave enough surface. Then the track turned slightly, and the soil type changed, and I felt it immediately. A softening under the front wheels, a change in steering resistance as the tires began to sink. I gave it more throttle. The engine note rose. The bus lurched slightly. Not badly. just the sensation of the drive axle working harder. I kept the wheel straight and kept the throttle steady, because the worst thing you can do in soft ground with a heavy vehicle is hesitate. Hesitate makes it worse. You want momentum and commitment. For about 40 seconds, I genuinely wasn't sure we were going to make it. The rear axle was working hard. I could feel it. The extra weight of the fuel drums on the roof rack was not helping, and there was a moment when the bus slowed, despite full throttle, and the tires made a sound I didn't like at all, the sound of displacement rather than traction. And then the wheel track curved left, and the soil firmed, and I was through it. I let out a breath that I'd been holding for 40 seconds, and kept moving. Behind us, through the rear window, Colleen reported that there was no pursuit on the field track, which made sense. A pickup truck would have no better luck on that ground than we'd had, and potentially worse. We came out onto the Fermer County road system about a mile later, and I turned west without stopping. Patty said, "Good driving." I said, "Thank Roger. It was his road." Roger said, "It was your driving." We agreed to disagree, and kept moving. Frank's group didn't make another direct approach for a while after that. We saw one of their trucks twice at a distance over the following week, tracking us on a parallel road, close enough to confirm they were following, far enough to not force a confrontation. It was the kind of aggressive patience that I found more uncomfortable than a direct approach would have been. Roger told me more about Frank during those days. Frank's full name was Frank Nutter, which was almost too convenient as a name, and yet that was what it was. He was somewhere in his 50s, ex-logistics according to Roger, supply chain management, fleet operations, that kind of background. He'd been traveling with a group since very early in the outbreak, and the group had grown by absorption, and occasionally by coercion. By Roger's estimate, there were 15 to 20 people with Frank, in the 3-vehicle setup Roger had described, and they were well supplied in a way that suggested systematic looting of fuel and food from the areas they moved through. Roger had joined them at week 2 because his own situation, alone, on foot, food running out, had been untenable, and Frank had appeared to be organized. It took him about 5 days to realize that the organization was real, but the ethics were not, and by that point, leaving required actual planning. He found the right moment, a fuel stop, where Frank's attention was elsewhere, and walked away with his tablet and his knowledge and the clothes on his back. What I didn't fully understand until later was that Frank's interest in Roger was specifically about me. About the bus. Roger's knowledge of the survey roads was useful, but Frank had been looking for a heavy vehicle with fuel range and payload capacity. And once he knew Roger had gotten onto my bus, the bus became the target. I found this out from a conversation I overheard that I wasn't meant to hear, between Roger and Walt, on a night when I'd gone under the bus to check the bearing repair, and they thought I was out of earshot. Roger was telling Walt that Frank had known about the bus since the rail yard, had known, which meant someone at the rail yard had talked to Frank's people about what they'd found there, and Frank's move to intercept us at the cooperative had been the first in what was planned as a series of escalating approaches. I didn't interrupt the conversation. I finished checking the bearing, and I went back inside, and I slept on it for a night. In the morning, I told Roger what I'd heard. He was quiet for a while. Then he said, "I was going to tell you." I said, "When?" He said, "When I thought you'd handle it better." I said, "How do I seem like I'm handling it now?" He said, "Honestly, pretty well." I said, "Good, then tell me what else you haven't told me yet." He told me. It took about 2 hours. Some of what he told me was about Frank and what Frank wanted. Some of it was about Roger himself, about why his connection to the survey work had made him a target, and about some decisions he'd made in the early days of the outbreak that he was not proud of. Nothing that changed what I thought of him fundamentally, but things that added context. He was a person who'd made choices under pressure and was living with what those choices had produced, which put him in a category with everyone else on the bus, and with me. I said, "Bev." He said, "What?" I said, "You mentioned a sister before, early on. Said her name was Bev." He said, "She was in Rhinelander. I don't know if she's still there." I said, "We're going to be in that area next week." given Roger's roads. He said, You don't have to do that. I said, I know I don't. He said, She might not be there. I said, I know that too. He sat with that. Then he said, Thank you. I said, Don't thank me yet. Bev was there. We found her in Rhinelander in a second-floor apartment above a closed hardware store, where she'd been for 6 weeks, subsisting on a combination of what she'd had in her kitchen and what she'd been able to get from the hardware store below. The store had some dry goods in a back room, the kind of stuff hardware stores carry that people never buy, but that's there when you need it. She'd lost weight and she'd lost sleep, and she'd lost her outdoor cat, who'd gotten out during the first week and hadn't come back, and she told us about the cat with more emotion than she told us about some of the other things, which I completely understood. Bev was Roger's older sister by 4 years, which put her at about 33. She looked like Roger in the way siblings sometimes look like each other. Not similar faces, just similar ways of holding themselves, a shared physical vocabulary. She was quieter than Roger, more economical with words, not shy, but not chatty. She had a nursing degree that she'd been using at a clinic in Rhinelander before the outbreak, and that immediately made her the most medically qualified person on the bus by a considerable margin. She looked at our medical supplies and said, very calmly, Whoever put this together knew what they were doing. I said, Patty did most of it. She looked at Patty. Patty said, I had a child break his femur on the playground once. After that, I took an interest. Bev said, The IV antibiotics, the powder. Do you have any reconstitution supplies? Patty said, Sterile water and IV lines. In the blue bag. Bev said, Okay, good. That was it. She was aboard. She asked almost no questions about the situation, about the bus, about the plan, about where we were going or who the other people were. She just absorbed the available information, cataloged the resources, and started contributing. It was one of the cleanest integrations of a new person I'd seen since this whole thing started. I liked her on the second day, when she and I were doing a supply inventory together, and she said, without looking up from the canned goods she was organizing, How bad is it? Honestly. I said, The bus is solid. The fuel situation is manageable for another month or so, with what we have. Food supply is okay. The threat from other people is real and ongoing. She said, What about the infected? I said, Manageable if we stay mobile. Problematic if we stop. She said, How mobile do we stay? I said, I try not to stay anywhere more than 2 days. The rail yard was 11 days, and it was probably too long. She said, What's the plan? I said, Keep moving west. Roger has infrastructure data that tells us where there might be fuel and supplies. We've been following it, and it's been reliable. She said, And after that? I said, I don't have an after that yet. She looked at me. She said, That's an honest answer. I said, I try. 6 people in the bus now. I'd started thinking about the seating differently. The balance of weight, the sight lines from each seat to the mirrors, who was sleeping when, who was watching what. A living system in a box, moving through a changed world, burning diesel and using up supplies and making decisions. I drove. That was my primary function, and I tried to be good at it. The ghost signal happened in the dead zone north of the Chippewa River, which is an area where radio reception is poor under normal circumstances because of the terrain and the relative absence of infrastructure. We'd been through 2 days where we couldn't get any broadcast on the CB radio or the AM band, which was not unusual. Organized broadcasts had been getting spotty for weeks, the emergency frequencies cycling through automated loop messages and occasional live human voices, and then long stretches of nothing. The signal we caught on AM was not the settlement frequency. That was the first thing. It was on a standard AM frequency, 1070 kilohertz, which used to be a news station out of the Twin Cities. The transmission was clear in a way that suggested a nearby source rather than a distant one. And it was a voice. A woman's voice, calm, even-paced, repeating the same 3 words on a loop, with about a 5-second pause between repetitions. Not yet ready. Not yet ready. Not yet ready. I stopped the bus when I found the frequency. Turned the volume up. Everyone was quiet. Not yet ready. Colleen said, "What does that mean?" Nobody answered. Bev reached past me and tuned slightly to either side of the frequency, found nothing, came back to 1070. "Not yet ready." Walt said, "It could be a message." I said, "Obviously." He said, "I mean a specific message to a specific person, not a broadcast." Roger said, "If it's on AM, it's a broadcast, by definition." Walt said, "Unless it's a very low-power transmitter, something that only has a few miles of range." I looked at the signal strength indicator. Steady, not decaying, not yet ready. I drove slowly forward. The signal held for about a mile, then started to fade. I stopped, reversed, went back to the spot where the signal had been strongest, got out of the bus, stood in the road in the late afternoon, and looked in every direction. Fields, tree lines, an empty county road going north and south and east and west. Nothing that should be transmitting. Not yet ready. I stood there for another minute. The signal was coming from. It was hard to say exactly. The AM frequency isn't precise in terms of directionality, but the null of the antenna suggested it was either from the north or the south. I looked north. The road curved and disappeared into a line of trees about half a mile away. I drove north. The signal faded. Came back to the strong point when I drove back. Not yet ready. We sat on that county road for 40 minutes trying to figure it out. Eventually I moved on, because staying in one place for 40 minutes was not something I was comfortable doing anymore. The signal faded as we moved west, dropped below audible in about 2 miles. Nobody figured it out. Nobody has since. I still tune to 1070 occasionally, in that area or anywhere, and I've never heard it again. Colleen said, the night after we heard it, "What if it's the answer to a question that hasn't been asked yet?" I said, "That's a weird thing to say." She said, "Yeah." She didn't elaborate. "I've thought about it a lot. Not yet ready. I don't know if it means anything. Probably it was some automated system, some pre-recorded message keyed to transmit when some condition was met, and the condition got met, and the system ran its loop and ran it, and it means exactly what it sounds like it means, that something isn't ready, for some specific and practical reason that no longer applies to anyone who's still alive. Probably. Month 3 is when the bus stopped being just a survival vehicle and became something else, and I'm not sure I have a word for what it became. Home doesn't quite fit, because home implies a permanence that the bus didn't have. Community feels too organized, too intentional. Maybe just us, just what we were. The 6 of us in 45 feet of reinforced steel and diesel power, moving through a world that had reorganized itself entirely around different rules. We had routines by month 3. That surprised me, how quickly routines formed and how important they became. I'm not a routine person by nature. I've lived alone for most of my adult life and my habits are casual and inconsistent, and I don't notice when I skip things. But in the bus, with other people, routines became structural. They held the day together. Mornings. Colleen and Patty were usually first up, Colleen checking what I'd started calling the perimeter. She had a rotation of vantage points around the bus's windows, where she'd spend 5 minutes each morning looking and listening before declaring a condition status, and Patty starting the camp stoves for breakfast. Roger checked his tablet first thing every morning, updating his route notes based on what we'd seen the day before, cross-referencing his supply location data. Bev did a quick medical check of the group, not clinical, just eyes on, making sure no one was developing anything concerning. I checked the bus, engine oil, coolant, air pressure in the tires, any change in the sound or feel of the drive components, battery bank charge level, fuel status. This took maybe 20 minutes, and I did it every single morning, regardless of what had happened the night before, or how little sleep I'd gotten, because the bus was the thing that kept all of us alive, and it was not something I was going to defer maintenance on. Deferring maintenance is how things fail. Evenings, quieter. People found their own private spaces within the small available space. Patty always took the 3rd row seat to read, Roger went to the rear lounge. Colleen sometimes climbed to the roof if the situation was safe enough, which she judged independently, and she was good at judging it. Bev and I sometimes sat in the two front seats, not talking necessarily, just being in the same space while the bus sat, and the world outside settled into its own nighttime version of itself. Bev and I didn't talk about what we were doing when we sat in the front seats together. I mean that we didn't name it. We talked about practical things, mostly. Supply calculations, route decisions, what we'd seen that day. Sometimes we didn't talk at all, but I was aware, in those hours, of a kind of company that I hadn't had in a long time. Not romantic exactly, or not only romantic, but something that felt like being known by another person in real time, which is different from being liked. I mention this because it's true, and because this is a record of what happened, and what happened included that. Bev was clear-eyed and steady, and she had a very precise sense of what was necessary versus what was optional, which I found enormously useful. She didn't perform calmness. She was just calm, or as close to it as anyone was, and the difference mattered. I don't know what she thought about me. I didn't ask. Frank's second approach was direct. 7th week of month 3, or month 4. I'd lost count of what I was calling which month. We were on a state highway going south, trying to reach a fuel source Roger had found in the survey data about 40 miles away, a commercial propane storage facility that he thought might still have diesel in its maintenance vehicles. The road ahead of us had a vehicle in it. Across both lanes, a black SUV, parked broadside, a person standing next to it, arms at their sides, not infected. I slowed the bus to a stop at 100 yards. The person by the SUV didn't move, just stood there. This is the oldest ambush setup in the world, and I've driven emergency vehicles long enough to know that the most likely follow-up to this kind of stop is something coming from behind. I looked in the rearview mirror. The road behind us was empty. I said, "What's the setup?" Roger said, from behind me, "I don't know. This isn't how they've done it before." I said, "Colleen." She said, "Rear's clear." I said, "Bev, passenger window." The right side of the road had a ditch and then a tree line, and if I were planning an ambush, that's where I'd want people. Bev went to the right side and looked. She said, "I don't see anything." Patty said, "The person by the SUV is waving." I looked. The person had both arms up now, moving slowly, not frantically. The body language said, "Come forward, come forward." I sat with it for a moment. Then I said, "I'm going to do a short move. Everyone stay seated." I moved the bus forward slowly, maybe 30 yards, stopped again. The person by the SUV was a woman, mid-40s I could see now. Short hair, heavy jacket, boots. She had no weapon visible. She was looking at the bus with an expression I couldn't read at this distance. I opened my window, and she walked toward me at a pace that wasn't threatening, deliberate, hands visible. She stopped about 20 feet from the driver's window and said, "You're the armored bus. You've been through the relay areas." I said, "What are you?" She said, "I'm the person who's going to tell you about the settlement, but not on the road. I need you to come to the relay station." I said, "What relay station?" She said, "The frequency. You've been receiving the broadcast." I said, "Which broadcast?" She said, "You know which one." I looked at her for a long moment. Then I said, "What's your name?" She said, "Patricia Voss. I worked in emergency management for Chippewa County, and I need to talk to your group about something that's happening about 80 miles south of here." Roger came up the aisle and looked at her through my window. He said, quietly, "She's not Frank's." I said, "How do you know?" He said, "Frank's people are careful not to announce themselves before they have to. This is different." She came out. I looked at Patty Bowman in the front passenger seat. Patty was looking at the woman outside with a measured expression, and then she looked at me and she gave a small nod, which is Patty's way of saying she trusts her instinct on this, and her instinct says proceed. I said to the woman outside, "Patricia Voss, get in." She said, "I have another person in the SUV." I said, "Just one?" She said, "Just one. My colleague, Terry." I said, Tell Terry to come with their hands visible. Terry was a man in his 40s who walked over with his hands raised and an expression that said he'd been doing the hands raised walk a lot lately and had made peace with it. He had a radio unit hanging from his belt, a proper repeater quality handheld, not the consumer stuff. They came aboard. The SUV stayed where it was. Patricia Voss. She said to call her Pat, which caused a brief moment where we had two Patties in the conversation before we sorted out that our Patty was Patty Bowman and this was Pat Voss. No conflict. She told us about the settlement in about 45 minutes of steady talking. The settlement was a town called Glenwood City, about 80 miles south and east of our current position, not a natural settlement. It had been organized, deliberately, by a group that included several people with emergency management and community planning backgrounds, starting in the second week of the outbreak. They had fortified the town's perimeter, established food production, set up water treatment, and had been running a rotating broadcast on several frequencies to let survivors know about it. The broadcast we'd been receiving was their general invitation signal. The not yet ready signal on AM was something else. Pat said she didn't know what it was, and that no one in Glenwood City had been running that frequency. She looked slightly unsettled by that information, which I noticed. The community in Glenwood City had about 200 people. It had food, fuel, medical capacity, and some security. It had a diesel mechanic and an electrician, but it did not have a heavy vehicle with range and defensive capability, which was something they needed for the supply runs they were increasingly unable to make in smaller vehicles. I said, "So you need the bus." Pat said, "We need the bus and the people with the skills to operate it." I said, "The route to Glenwood City." Pat said, "There are two. The direct route goes through the western edge of the Twin Cities metro area, which is not advisable. The other route goes south, through an area that's been difficult." Roger was already on his tablet. He said, "I have a road network through that area. It's not all confirmed. Some of it's theoretical." Pat said, "There are sections where we've had," she paused, "situations. We lost 2 vehicles and their teams in the past month, trying different routes." Patty Bowman said, "What kind of situations?" Pat said, "One was an infected concentration larger than we'd seen in the rural areas. One was a group of people who took the vehicles." I looked at Roger. Roger didn't look back. I said, "Frank Nutter." Pat looked at me. "You know about him?" I said, "He's been following us for about a month." She said, "He's been operating between here and Glenwood City for 2 months. Intercepting vehicles, taking supplies. He knows about the settlement, but he hasn't. He's been building up to something. We think he wants the settlement's food and fuel stores." I said, "How many people does he have now?" She said, "Our last count was between 25 and 30. He's been growing." I said, "He had 3 vehicles when Roger left him. What now?" Pat looked at Roger. Roger looked at me, and then at her. Pat said, 7 vehicles, 2 heavy trucks. The bus was very quiet for a few seconds. Bev said, "If we drive to Glenwood City, we drive through his operating area." Pat said, "Yes." Bev said, "And he's been looking for this bus specifically." Pat said, "Yes." I said, "Tell me about the route." We talked route for 2 hours. Roger's survey data, Pat's field intelligence, Terry's knowledge of the specific roads they'd used on the 2 failed attempts. I drew it on my paper map, not a clean line, more of a corridor, with primary and secondary and tertiary options at each decision point. Then I said, "Give me until morning." Pat and Terry stayed aboard. I gave them the use of the rear lounge, and I drove us to a position I liked better. Off the main road, behind an abandoned implement dealer, good sight lines in 3 directions. Killed the engine. Everyone settled in. I sat in the driver's seat with my map and a headlamp and thought for a long time. Here's what the decision looked like from where I was sitting. The bus was solid, but not invincible. The route to Glenwood City had unknowns. Roger's unconfirmed roads, the possibility of large infected concentrations, and Frank Nutter's group somewhere in the operating area, with 7 vehicles, and an established interest in the bus. The upside was 200 people, a fixed location, food production, medical capacity, and the possibility that the thing we'd been doing, this constant movement, burning down the fuel reserve, living in a 45-foot box, could stop, at least for a while, at least until something else. The downside was the route. I thought about what I'd built, what I'd done in March and April in that garage in Madison, when I'd been welding steel plates to a bus, and telling myself it was just anxiety work. The ram on the front, the bearing repair I'd done on the side of a county road with a bad shoulder, the fuel drums on the roof and the water system, and the medical supplies and the window grills that I'd pre-built before I fully understood why. I thought about Kira in Portland, and whether she was still in Astoria, or whether something had happened. I thought about what it meant that I hadn't heard from her, and I did the exercise I always do with that thought, which is, no news doesn't mean anything yet. No news is not data. No news is just absence. I thought about the $11.40 a month. Then I stopped thinking about things that didn't help and went back to the map. In the morning, I told everyone what I'd decided. I said, "We're going to try for Glenwood City. I have conditions." Pat said, "What conditions?" I said, "We take Roger's roads where Roger says they're viable, and we take Pat's intelligence where Roger's data doesn't reach. We don't commit to the route until we're on it, and we keep contingency options open at every major junction. If we get into something we can't get through, we don't push it. We back out and find another way." Pat said, "How long will that take?" I said, "Longer than you want it to. 2 days minimum, possibly 4. She said, "We need the vehicle." I said, "You'll have it, but not crashed. If I push the bus past its limit, and we lose it, you don't have it either, and neither do I." She said, "That's reasonable." I looked at Patty Bowman, who had a small smile, and she said, "I knew I liked her." The drive to Glenwood City. I want to be careful about how I write this, because some of what happened on that drive is not something that gets easier to describe with time. But it happened, and the record should say it happened. Day 1 was the corridor through the agricultural areas south of Chippewa County. Roger's roads were accurate and clear. The back routes he'd surveyed held up. The soil was firm enough in the current conditions, and we made 40 miles before stopping for the night in a position Roger had flagged as a good stopping point. A large gravel lot behind a grain elevator with only 2 road approaches, both visible. Frank's vehicles showed up at mile 31. Not in an ambush configuration this time. Just visible, a pickup truck on a parallel road, pacing us at about 300 yards. Then a second vehicle joined it. They kept pace for about 4 miles, and then dropped back and disappeared. Roger said, "They're watching, logging the route." I said, "They know where we're going." He said, "If they've been intercepting the settlement's broadcasts, they might have figured it out already." I said, "What would Frank want with Glenwood City?" Roger was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Everything they've built. 200 people means labor. Food production means food. Fuel stores mean vehicles. And if someone with Frank's mentality controls access to the only functioning community in 200 miles, they control a lot." I said, "So he's not just going to let us drive in?" Roger said, "No." We reached our stop for the night without incident. I ran a full mechanical check of the bus. The bearing was fine. All the recent welding was solid. Tire pressures good. And then I slept poorly and was up before anyone else and sat in the driver's seat, watching the gray come up over the fields. Day 2. The route on day 2 went through a larger town than anything we'd navigated in several weeks. Not a city, but substantial enough. Population maybe 8,000 before. Roger had a bypass route that kept us on the town's west side, using industrial service roads, and it should have avoided the density of the town's main streets. Should have. The service road we needed crossed a rail line, and the rail line had a derailed freight car across it. Not a huge blockage. 1 car, jackknifed, but enough to block the road completely. I stopped the bus and looked at it. The ram could maybe push through it. Freight cars are heavy, 70,000, 80,000 pounds, but they're also sitting on wheels, and the jackknifed car was on its side, so the wheels were up, meaning it was sitting on the frame and the body, which was worse for resistance. I didn't like those odds for the bus. Pat said, "Is there another way?" I said, "Through town." Roger said, "Main Street or..." "There's one more option. The town's industrial park is on the north side. There's an access road along the rail spur that bypasses the derailment." Said, "How close does it take us to the town center?" He said, "About a quarter mile." I said, "What do you know about infected concentration in the town?" He said, "I don't know anything about this town. I didn't have assignments here." I looked at the derailed car, looked at my map, looked at Roger. I said, "Rail spur road. Let's move." The industrial park access road was fine for the first half mile. Then it opened onto a wider road that ran along the back of the industrial buildings, and that road had something on it. There were about 40 or 50 of them, concentrated in an area that had probably been a loading dock at some point. A large open apron in front of a warehouse building, surrounded by concrete barriers. They were densely packed into the apron, moving in tight circles and into each other, with the completely indifferent body mechanics that the infected use. They weren't moving in our direction yet, because we'd been running quiet. I'd shifted to the lowest practical speed, barely above idle, which kept the engine noise down. The road I needed was on the far side of this concentration, about 150 yards through and past them. I said, "Everybody quiet. Hands off anything that might make a sound." I moved the bus forward very slowly, walking pace. The engine was barely turning over. The tires on the road surface made some noise, but not much. I'd put rubber mat strips in the wheel wells months ago to reduce road noise transmission, and they were earning their keep. 30 yards. One of the infected at the edge of the concentration turned. Not toward us, just turned, as if reorienting to some internal direction. The movement was visible from inside the bus, and everyone saw it, and nobody made a sound. 50 yards. The concentration was to our right now, the concrete barriers at the edge of the apron, about 20 feet from the bus's right side. I could see individual faces. I try not to look at individual faces because it goes somewhere I can't afford to go while I'm driving. But I looked, unavoidably, and what I saw was, I need to say this plainly, people who had been people, not the horror movie thing. Just people, in whatever they'd been wearing when it happened, going through a continuous, useless motion that served nothing. I looked back at the road and drove. 80 yards. Something on the bus made a sound. I don't know what it was. Something settling, some vibration resonating through the frame into a loose panel. A small sound, probably less than 10 decibels. But small sounds matter. The nearest infected turned, then the ones next to it. Then the ones next to those. I accelerated. Not dramatically, not full throttle, but enough to put some speed behind us. Enough to get clear of the concentration before the wave of orientation and movement could reach us. I felt the bus surge under me, the engine note rising from whisper to conversation, and I watched in the mirror as the concentration began its turn, the whole mass of it shifting in our direction, like water following a tilted surface. We were through before it mattered. I kept the accelerated pace until we were a full quarter-mile clear, then eased back. Nobody spoke for a minute. Then Colleen said, "There was a woman in there, in a veterinary scrub top." I said, "Yeah." She said, "I keep thinking about what they were doing when it happened." I said, "I know." She said, "Sorry." I said, "Don't be. Keep watching the rear." She watched the rear. Frank's people met us 12 miles from Glenwood City. Not a surveillance pair this time. 7 vehicles, across the road ahead of us, in a configuration that said this was the plan they'd been building toward. 3 on the main road, 4 spread out into the fields on either side in a loose flanking arc. People with them, some with weapons visible. I stopped the bus at 200 yards. Frank Nutter was standing in front of the vehicle line. I could see him. The description Roger had given me was accurate enough. Medium height, fit in an operational way, calm body language. He had a radio in one hand. He just stood there. I said, "Pat." She said, "Yes." I said, "Is there any possibility he's bluffing?" She said, very carefully, "With everything he's done in the past 2 months, no." I said, "Roger." Roger said, "Yeah." I said, "Is there anything in the survey data between here and Glenwood City? Anything we haven't used?" He was already on the tablet, scrolling, tapping, going through data faster than I could follow. Then he stopped. He said, "There's a railroad right-of-way that runs parallel to this road, about a mile east. It's graded and maintained, or was maintained, last time I had data on it, which was 18 months ago. It goes all the way to the south outskirts of Glenwood City." I said, "Condition of the surface." He said, "Crushed limestone ballast. It's a rail bed without the rails. They were pulled for salvage a couple years back. The grade is compacted." I said, "Width." He said, "Wide enough." The right-of-way is cleared to about 30 feet on either side. The graded surface is maybe 15 feet. I looked at the front axle tracking width of the bus. About 8 feet. The rear axle was 8.4. I had about 3 feet of clearance on each side on a 15-foot surface. I said, "How do we get to it?" He said, "About a quarter mile north. There's a field crossing, farm access, if the gate's open or manageable." I said, "We're not going back north. He'll close on us." He said, "Then we need to cut across the field." From here, I looked at the field. Winter wheat, or what was left of it, green and short. The soil looked firm. I'd driven softer. I said, "Okay." I reversed the bus. Not far, just enough to clear the edge of the road shoulder and onto the field margin. Then I turned right, off the road, and drove east across the field. Frank's group would see this from their position, and they'd try to intercept. The vehicles in the flanking arc on our right would be the problem. I pushed the speed up. The bus moved across the field at about 35 miles per hour, which is as fast as you drive a 45-foot vehicle across uneven ground if you want to maintain control. The ride was rough. Everyone in the bus was grabbing whatever was within reach, and the weight of the fuel drums on the roof was making the suspension work hard in the roll axis. 2 of Frank's vehicles came into the field on our right, trying to cut across to intercept. A pickup and an SUV, moving faster than I was moving. They had a better surface-to-weight ratio on the uneven ground. The pickup closed to about 100 yards, then 70. I could see the railroad right-of-way ahead, a slightly elevated ridge of the grade, the crushed limestone pale against the field. I drove straight at it. The angle of approach to a railroad grade matters. You want to be close to perpendicular, or the vehicle can slide on the slope. I adjusted the line as I came in, angling the nose slightly left to hit it straighter. The bus went up the grade. The front end lifted maybe 8 inches as we hit the slope, then settled as the rear followed. The transition from field to ballast was jarring but clean. I straightened up on the right-of-way and accelerated. The pickup tried to follow. I watched it in the mirror. It hit the grade at a worse angle, the right front dropping into the ditch beside the grade, and it stopped. The SUV pulled up beside it. We were on the right-of-way, and they weren't. I drove south on the crushed limestone, 12 miles per hour. The surface was good, but I didn't want to go faster with the lateral clearance I had. And the bus tracked true, and the engine ran steady, and the afternoon light was doing something particular to the open right-of-way. All that pale limestone stretching ahead in a corridor between fields. Pat said, "Behind me, is this going to get us there?" I said, "Yeah." She said, "How far?" I said, "About 9 miles." She was quiet. Then she said, "Thank you." I said, "Wait until we're there." Glenwood City was not what I expected. Not dramatic, not walls and watchtowers and lights in the distance. Just a town that was still functioning. That sounds small until you've been in enough towns that were not functioning anymore, and then it sounds like the most extraordinary thing in the world. We came in from the north end, down a side street, and there was someone at the intersection with a handheld radio who waved us through and directed us to a staging area beside what had been the Municipal Public Works building. The staging area had fuel. They came with hoses and started filling the auxiliary connections before we'd even gotten out of the bus, which told me something about how they operated. I got out and stood next to the bus. And it was the first time in, I don't know, months. The first time in months that I'd stood outside somewhere and not been doing a threat assessment of every direction. People came to look at the bus. They were quiet about it, not gawking, more like how you look at something that represents something, something that means someone made an effort, and the effort resulted in a thing that's real and solid and still in one piece. A man came over who introduced himself as Dale Ferris, who'd been the Glenwood City Public Works Director and was now something between mayor and logistics coordinator. He shook my hand and looked at the bus and said, "We've been waiting for this." I said, "For the bus specifically." He said, "For someone who could get here." I said, "I should tell you, there's a group that's been tracking us. They'll know we made it." He said, "Frank Nutter." I said, "Yes." He said, "We've been expecting that too." We talked for about an hour. I told him everything I knew about Frank, the vehicle count, the operational approach, the timeline of encounters. He told me everything he knew about Glenwood City's defenses and resources, which was honest and thorough, and included things that were impressive and things that were not. And I appreciated that he didn't skip the things that were not. He said, "We need the bus for supply runs. We have routes that need your range and your defensive capability." I said, "I'll do supply runs. I need to do maintenance first. I have a bearing situation and some other items that need attention while I have access to proper equipment." He said, "We have a shop. Not a full commercial shop, but it's equipped." I said, "Good." He said, "What else do you need?" I thought about it. Then I said, "I don't know yet. Let me stay a few days and see what's true about this place." He said, "That's reasonable." I've been in Glenwood City for 3 weeks now. I'm writing this in the Public Works building, in a corner that I've set up as a workspace next to the shop area. The bus is outside. I can hear it occasionally when the wind hits the steel panels right. I've done the bearing carrier repair properly this time. I've also gone through the front axle and replaced both wheel seals, replaced 2 airbags in the suspension, and rebuilt the power steering pump, which had been weeping fluid at the high-pressure line for about a month. The bus is in better mechanical condition now than it's been since I left Madison. The people here are real. That's the main thing I can say about them. They are real people, doing difficult work with limited resources, and they are doing it with more competence and less drama than I've seen in any group since the outbreak started. Dale Ferris is not a charismatic leader in any movie sense. He's methodical and somewhat dry, and he apologizes when he's wrong, which is something I've come to value enormously. Patty has already been absorbed into the elementary school that's been restarted for the children in the settlement. There are about 30 kids here, and they needed organization and someone who knew how to run a school day. She hasn't said anything about it, but she walks differently in the morning than she did 3 weeks ago. Colleen is doing something with a small team that handles perimeter monitoring, which suits her better than I expected. She goes out every morning and comes back in the afternoon and tells me what she's seen in a clipped, efficient way that sounds nothing like a teenager and a lot like someone who's found their job. Roger and Bev are together in a way that they haven't said anything formal about, which is fine. Roger is working with the settlement's route planning group, feeding his survey knowledge into a more organized logistics system. Bev is working with the medical team. There are 3 other people with medical training here, and they're working through the supplies I brought and the supplies already here, and building something that looks like a clinic. Walt is the complicated part. Walt spent the first week here in quiet conversations with people I couldn't identify, and on day 10 he came to me and said that he was going to make the briefcase available to a specific person in the settlement who had a background in regulatory documentation. He said it in a way that suggested he'd been working toward this moment since March, since before the outbreak, since before everything. I said, "Is there anything that can be done with it?" He said, "In the short term, no. In the long term, if there is a long term, records matter. What happened matters. Who made the decision matters." I said, "And you need it on record." He said, "Yes." I said, "Okay, Walt." He said, "I know it doesn't fix anything." I said, "I know." He said, "That's reasonable." I said, "No, Walt, it's not. But do it anyway." He looked at me for a moment, and he nodded, and he took the briefcase to its destination. Frank Nutter's group appeared on the South Approach Road at the end of my second week here. Not an attack, a presence. The vehicles parked about a mile out, visible on the flat approach road, not moving, just there, like a statement. I was with Dale when someone came to tell us. I said, "How many vehicles?" The person who'd come to tell us said, 9. We counted 9. I looked at Dale. He looked at me. He said, "We have about 40 people who can defend. Weapons are adequate. The perimeter is solid." I said, "Frank doesn't want to fight, he might lose. He wants to make you afraid and then negotiate from the position that you're afraid." Dale said, "What does he want?" I said, "Access. If he can get access to Glenwood City's resources under terms he controls, he gets everything without the risk of a fight. He's been building toward this. He needs a community, because a group of 25 people in 7 vehicles is not a sustainable long-term position, and he knows it." Dale said, "So he's going to ask to join." I said, "He's going to present it as a mutual benefit. He has the vehicles and the people and the operational experience. You have the infrastructure. He'll say it's a partnership." Dale said, "And if we say no?" I said, "He'll make things uncomfortable until you say yes." We looked at the 9 vehicles on the road for a few more seconds. Dale said, "What would you do?" I said, "I'd say no." He said, "And when he makes it uncomfortable?" I said, "I'd go make a supply run and let him sit there and think about whether 40 people inside a perimeter and a bus that can move faster than anything he has is actually a position he wants to be in opposition to." Dale said, "That's aggressive." I said, "It's honest." He thought about it. Then he said, "Let me think about it overnight." I said, "Okay." He said, "What would the supply run be?" I said, "There's an agricultural cooperative about 60 miles northeast that Roger has data on. They had a cold storage facility with backup generator. If it's been running and the food's still good, it's 6 months of supply for the settlement." Dale said, "When could you go?" I said, 2 days. I need to finish the suspension work." He said, "Go in 2 days. I'll handle Frank." I said, "How?" He said, "I'll talk to him. I'm good at talking to people while saying nothing." I said, "Dale." He said, I know what he is." He looked at the vehicles on the road for another moment. "I just need enough time for you to come back." I left 2 days later. Just me this time. No passengers. I told everyone else to stay, and I wasn't asking. Bev looked at me, and I looked back, and she didn't argue. Roger gave me the coordinates for the cooperative. Patty gave me a written list of priority items. Colleen came to the bus as I was doing the pre-departure check, and she handed me something. A handwritten page of notes about the approach roads to the cooperative. Things she'd asked Roger to tell her, and then written down for me. She said, "In case you lose the radio." I said, "Thanks." She said, "Come back." I said, "I intend to." She nodded and walked away. I drove out the north approach, which was not the approach Frank's vehicles were parked on. The road was clear, and the morning was gray and cold, and the engine ran steady. I got to highway speed. Well, highway speed for a bus on back roads, which is about 55. And I held it there, and the suspension handled it, and the bearing carrier was good, and the tire pressures were where I wanted them. I had the radio on. Not for music. There was no music. For the frequencies I monitored. The settlement's frequency, the CB channels, and occasionally, when I passed through certain areas, 1070 AM. About 30 miles north, coming through a low stretch between 2 ridges, I tuned to 170. Static. For a minute, just static. Then, not yet ready. Clear as the first time. A woman's voice, the same repetition. Not yet ready. I drove through the area where it was strong. The signal held for maybe 2 minutes. Then it faded. I didn't stop this time. I just noted it and kept driving. I don't know what it means. I've decided it means something, and I've decided I won't know what until I do. which is not a particularly satisfying conclusion, but it's the honest one. The cooperative was 63 miles from Glenwood City. I found it in the early afternoon. The cold storage facility was exactly what Roger's data had said. A large, insulated building with a backup generator that was still running, still maintained by whatever automated system had been set up before the outbreak, still keeping the temperature at a consistent 34 degrees Fahrenheit. Inside the facility was food. 6 months of it, at minimum, probably more. I stood in the doorway of that cold storage building for a while, just stood there. The cold air came out around me, and I could smell the particular smell of stored produce, and the hum of the generator was steady and completely ordinary, the most ordinary sound I'd heard in months. I started loading the bus. It took 4 hours. I moved at a good pace, not frantic, just steady and efficient. The bus was loaded to the rear axle limit, which I calculated carefully, and hit within about 2% of my estimate. There was a lot I couldn't take. I noted the coordinates precisely, and the inventory of what was left, and I intended to come back with a second run, or with other vehicles from the settlement, as soon as possible. I started the bus and headed back south. About 20 miles out from Glenwood City, my radio lit up on the settlement frequency. Dale's voice. He said, "You should come in on the east approach. The north we have some activity." I said, "Frank?" He said he brought some people to the perimeter. "We're not in a full situation, but the north approach isn't clean." I said, "East approach. Is it clear all the way?" He said, "Roger says yes. You'll see a water tower on your right. Take the road past it." I said, "Okay, 20 minutes." I came in on the east side, and Roger was waiting at the intersection, before the settlement perimeter, with his hand up, directing me through a gap in the barrier. I pulled through, and the barrier went back in place behind me. Inside the settlement, I stopped the bus and got out, and people came to start unloading. Dale was there. He looked at the loaded bus, and then at me, and he said, "You got it." I said, "We need to go back for the rest. 2 runs, maybe 3. He said, "We'll do it." I said, "What's the situation with Frank?" He said, "He had 9 people come to the perimeter this morning. No weapons visible. They stood there for about 2 hours and then left. I went out and talked to Frank, and he was reasonable. Pleasant even. He said he wants to arrange a meeting." I said, "That's not a good sign." Dale said, "I know." I said, "What did you tell him?" He said, "I told him I'd think about it." I said, "Good. Keep thinking about it for a while." He said, "How long?" I looked at the bus, looked at the settlement, thought about 9 vehicles and Roger's roads and what it would mean to have a sustained supply operation running through the area Frank claimed. I said, "Long enough for me to make 2 more runs and get this place in the position it would be in if it didn't need to negotiate." He said, "And then what?" I said, "I don't know yet, but I'd rather make that decision from a full pantry than an empty one." He said, "That's reasonable." I said, "I've been hearing that phrase too much lately." He said, "Is that a problem?" I said, "No, it's probably fine. I'm writing this on the 41st day in Glenwood City. 3 supply runs complete, a 4th planned for next week, to a different location Roger identified, an agricultural processor outside of Baldwin that might still have grain. If it does, it changes the settlement's food equation for the foreseeable future. The bus is in the shop getting new brake shoes. I pulled the rear brakes because the wear indicator had been creeping toward the service limit, and while I was in there, I replaced the spring brakes on both rear axles because the springs were starting to fatigue, and spring brake failure is not a situation I ever want to discover on the road. The brakes are the most important system on a heavy vehicle. I have said this to people who asked why I was spending so much time in the shop, and they have generally nodded and accepted it, and I think some of them understood, and some of them were just being polite. Frank's group is still out there. Dale has had 2 more conversations with Frank, both of which went the way Dale predicted. Pleasant, reasonable sounding, nothing resolved. Frank hasn't tried anything direct, and I think he's aware that the bus changes the math of a direct approach in ways he doesn't want. A vehicle with the mass, range, and defensive capacity of the bus operated by someone who's been driving it through everything for months and knows exactly what it'll do. That's not a target Frank wants to take, not head on. What he'll do next, I don't know. Dale doesn't know. Roger has opinions, and so do I, and we've been talking through the scenarios in the evenings. Him with his tablet, and me with my map. Going through what the approach roads look like, and where the weak points are, and what a group with 7 vehicles and 25 people would do if they wanted to pressure a settlement without committing to an open confrontation. The answer is probably a supply interdiction. Cut the routes I'm using, or make them too dangerous to use, and watch what the settlement's morale does when the supply runs stop. It's the obvious play. It's what I'd do if I were Frank, which is a thought I don't love having. So we're building alternatives. A second route structure, using Roger's data and some additional field reconnaissance that Colleen's been running on her morning perimeter checks. A redundancy in the fuel supply. There's a secondary diesel source about 15 miles away that I can reach without using the main roads. Communication protocols. And I'm going to finish the brake job and do the engine oil service, and check all the fluid levels, and make sure the bus is in the best condition it can be in. Because the bus is what we have, and I've been taking care of it long enough that taking care of it doesn't feel like a choice anymore. It's just what I do in the morning. Bev asked me last night what I was going to do. After. If there is an after. I said, I don't know. She said, if things stabilize. If Glenwood City becomes what Dale thinks it can become. What do you do then? I said, keep the bus running. She said, that's not an answer. I said, it's the answer I have. She looked at me for a while. We were in the front seats of the bus. It was late, the settlement quiet outside, the engine off for once, really off, and the bus was just a bus, sitting still in a public works yard. She said, when you were building it before, did you know what it was going to be? I said, I thought I was doing anxiety work. She said, you were doing anxiety work. It also turned into this. I said, yeah. She said, that's the thing about you that took me a while to figure out. You don't make plans. You make things. And then you find out what the plans are later. I thought about that. It was more accurate than I expected. I said, Kira's in Portland. Or Astoria. She said, I know. I said, eventually I'm going to try to find out. She said, I know that too. The settlement was quiet outside. The brake shoes were stacked on the workbench where I'd left them for the morning. The bus's frame held us. The steel I'd welded to it in March and April in a garage in Madison, while something terrible was building at a scale I couldn't see yet. The bar across the door, the grills on the windows, the ram on the front that I'd overbuilt because that's how I build things. I said, I named the bus the Marquess, back at the beginning. She said, I saw the letters, under the panel. I said, I should put the panel back, when this is over. She said, the Marquess. I said, after an English title. She said, dignified without being pretentious. I said, that's what I was going for. She said, did you get there? I said, ask me in a few months. The morning was going to start soon. The brake job wasn't going to finish itself. Somewhere south of us on the approach road, Frank Nutter was parked in one of his 7 vehicles, looking at the lights of a town that was still working, trying to figure out what it would take to make it his, and not quite managing to get the math to come out right. The bus had a full tank. The food supply was better than it had been in months. Roger had 17 new route options documented, and 4 of them were strong. Colleen could hit a target at 200 yards with the rifle she'd found in a rail yard. Walt's briefcase was in the hands of someone who might be able to do something with it someday, if someday ever became possible. My shoulder was still not right from whatever I did to it with the roof rack. I'd been compensating for it for long enough that I did it without thinking, which is either adaptation or delayed damage depending on when you get to look at it in hindsight. I was going to call 10:70 a.m. in the morning. I do this occasionally. I don't know why exactly. The signal's never there when I'm in Glenwood City. But I do it anyway. The same way I check the fluid levels even when I haven't driven anywhere. The same way I test the door bar even in a secure lot at 3 in the morning. Not yet ready. Maybe. Maybe that's what it meant. Maybe whoever was transmitting was talking about something specific and practical that had nothing to do with us, and was resolved or abandoned months ago. Probably. Or maybe it was talking about something that was still becoming true. I don't know. I stay honest about what I know and what I don't. It's one of the few habits I've been able to keep clean through all of this. The bus is outside. It'll run tomorrow. The brake job will get done. The supply run next week will get planned and executed, and the settlement's pantry will fill up a little more. And eventually, I'm going to find out what's west of here, past Frank Nutter's vehicles on the South Approach Road, past the agricultural areas Roger knows, and the ones he doesn't, toward Portland, and whoever's still there, and what that means.